Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? I'm doing great, and I hope you are as well. What's new? What a lovely, lovely evening slash afternoon it is. I am sitting here in front of my lovely bookshelf in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, and it is Sunday evening. The sky has just gotten dark here in New York City. Freezing cold day, but luckily I was able to walk through the freezing cold, get my hair cut, have a nice meal while I read through the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. And I think we're going to have a great discussion today. So much to talk about. So much to talk about. So, I don't know if folks have seen, the rumor is that Michael Bloomberg might want to have Hillary Clinton as his vice president nominee. I don't know if folks heard that right. The rumor is that Hillary Clinton might be the vice presidential nominee of Michael Bloomberg if he ends up running. Now, that's a rumor, not confirmed, and obviously no announcement has been made. Pretty wild. Furthermore, Israel is not too fond of Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders, if he were to become president, would be the first Jewish president of the United States. Regardless, Israel seems to be working to try and defeat him, according to some reports. So pretty wild world we're living in, right? Wild stuff going on. I see you're all here. We're going to have our great discussion like we always have this time of the week, weekend time. We always have a great chat. But if you haven't already done it, now is the time to hit the like button. Now is the time to hit the subscribe button. If you haven't if you've already subscribed, be sure to hit that bell so you get notifications. Remember that the YouTube algorithms do have this nasty, nasty habit of unsubscribing people, right? And it's based on who knows what, but it happens. So be absolutely positively sure that you're still subscribed, that you're getting the what do you call it? You're getting the notifications so that you join our conversations because you don't want to be left behind, right? We want everyone here. And now is also the time to cut and paste this link and put it on your Twitter. Invite all your friends to join the conversation. Now is also the time to like this conversation, to cut and paste it and put it on your Facebook wall, put it on your Instagram, put it on Reddit. Just bring people into the conversation. Make it a bigger chat. Every week I look and see who's done this, and I must say I deeply appreciate all of you who make this a bigger conversation. Don't keep the fun to yourself, right? Bring along people. The more people that are here, the more fun that we're going to have. Great times, folks. Great, great times. I'm seeing all kinds of stuff on social media, right? I'm seeing the Bernie Sanders campaign feeling really, really confident, despite the fact that it seems like MSNBC and CNN are working against them. I'm seeing folks pointing out that it seems like Fox News is friendlier to Bernie Sanders than the supposedly liberal or quote-unquote centrist outlets are. I'm seeing all kinds of stuff, and we're going to talk about all of this, right? And some good things are going on. Yeah, a lot is happening. Folks, before we get on to all of the business and all the news we want to talk about, I want to do that thing that I always do, where we have people call out their name and location so we can see who is here, right? We're starting it out, so start giving me your name and location. I see Arthur Porter, who's in Arizona. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Hi from Cleveland, says Pirate Alex. Broadway, North Carolina, says Matthew Jones. Las Vegas, says Alex Galicia. Australia, says Oz Whistles. Brian from Buffalo. Dylan Small from California. North Carolina. Heidi Edelweiss in Edinburgh. Right? Shaniqua in Buffalo. Jody from Wisconsin. Adam M. from Reno. Bob Marston from the East Bay area. California. David Fox from Australia. Boise, Idaho, 6-0. Hi from the UK, says Sami Jabber. Good afternoon, everyone from California, says Space Communist. Marissa in Buffalo, New York says, hey, Caleb, hey to you. Hi from the Philippines. Hi from Portugal. North Carolina, says Mark Shear. Hi, Caleb from Switzerland, says Andrew Nigel Robinson. Trevor from Ireland. Upstate New York, says Darth Buddha. Portugal, says Rafael Mello. What a great group of folks we got here. From Saxony, East Germany, Itatis. Wow. What great stuff, folks. Very cold in northern Michigan, says Punkarty. Tim from Liverpool, UK. Hello, Caleb, says Shadan. Hello from Houston, Texas, says Pickinfish. Hello from Puerto Rico, says Zanctus. Hello from New Jersey. Hello, CIA lurkers, says Space Communist. CIA is lurking, well, I'm sure. Rainy in South Florida says State Socialism. Hells from Toronto. Georgi Lukács from Hungary, LOL, says Arthur Porter. Leningrad, Soviet Union, the Netherlands. Who cares, right? Blessed brother, my love, says Andrew Nigel Robinson. Felix, Florida. Zanctus, already has our names here. Toronto, hi, it's Ollie. Langley, Virginia. That's a CIA joke, I'm sure. Fun times. Fun times. Folks, I really appreciate you all. Paul from Workingham, right? There is Big G Haywood. R&B from Los Angeles. It's cold in SoCal, he says. 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow, it's more like 24 degrees Fahrenheit where I'm at. Caleb, I enjoyed your piece demolishing PragerU. Thank you. Ramiro in Los Angeles, longtime friend of mine, good fella. Pirate Alex, Sweden. Hawaii, Kami from Hawaii. Glad you're with us. What else? Someone wants me to shout out to a friend of theirs named Michael Tanner. Okay, I don't know who that is, but I'll shout him out. Yes, so Troy S. is asking about what a couple people, and more than a few, were asking me on social media the other day. They wanted to know if I was willing to debate Miss Clara Sorrenti. Folks, I have thought long and hard about this. I saw that Miss Clara Sorrenti, a young person who I guess was at one point in the Communist Party of Canada, no longer is, was wanting to debate someone about China. She no longer supports the People's Republic of China. She no longer believes that the People's Republic of China is socialist. And she was doing one of those shout-out things that people do. She wanted to debate someone about it. And someone, I didn't follow this person on social media, but somebody sent me a message, a few people, and they asked me if I was up for having a debate with Ms. Sorrenti. And I considered it. And I even posted on social media, on Twitter, that, hey, I'm open to it. And now, roughly 24 hours later, I will give a solid answer to the question of will I be debating Ms. Clara Sorrenti about the issue of China. And my answer to the question is no. No, I will not be doing it. Folks, I'm happy to debate people, right? When I was in college, when I was a college student, I had my first big public debate. I debated a Republican on my campus. Over 100 people turned out on the campus to watch us debate. It's still on the internet. You can watch it. Great success. I had a debate with Augustus Sol Invictus, who's a white supremacist. I debated him, destroyed his white supremacist beliefs. I had a debate with Destiny Stephen Bonnell, the internet gamer who debates people. Went pretty well. And I'd like to have another debate sometime soon. I guess I'm supposed to debate somebody on Thursday on YouTube, and I do a podcast. I'm going to go on a big podcast on Wednesday. You'll be seeing that pretty soon, and I'm happy to do that. So, when I saw that this young person who's on the internet calling herself a communist and all of that and just wanting to have a debate, I was open to it. And within about an hour of me saying I was open to it, this person had referred to me as quote-unquote stupid. This person was kind of, letting go, so a lot of like kindergarten-level taunts. That made me start to think, this isn't a good idea, right? And then this morning, I guess I made the final decision when I looked over their Twitter page, or this person's Twitter page, in the aftermath of the whole thing, and this person's not having a good time. This person's having a little bit of a rough time, and I'm sorry to hear that. And folks, I want to tell you that any young person in the United States or Canada who is calling themselves a Marxist, engaging with Marxist ideas, who believes that we can get beyond capitalism to a rationally planned socialist society, any person like that is valuable. Any person like that deserves to be respected. Any person like that, shouldn't be underestimated, shouldn't be degraded. I get frustrated. You all know I get frustrated with socialists and leftists, right? But, I really do think that in this society we live in, loaded with pessimism, loaded with hopelessness, loaded with alienation and greed, that any person, who is especially any person under the age of 40 or 50, who anyone in their 20s or 30s, anyone in their teens, who comes to the conclusion that we can get to socialism is a good person. It is valuable, right? Now, I can't always work with such people, right? But at the same time, I don't wish them any ill will. I don't want to cause them any problem, right? And apparently this Clara person is having a rough time. And I'm sorry to see that. And I think that when someone's having a rough time, it's not good for me to get on and have an argument with them, especially when it appears that the argument would not be very civil, as I was called stupid, and a lot of really bizarre things were said to me just in the aftermath of suggesting it. Furthermore, it wouldn't be the best thing for this person necessarily for me to have a big argument with them that apparently, based on the looks of things, wouldn't go civil. So, I hope that any young person who is interested in socialism is able to make a contribution, is able to be optimistic and try to figure out how we can work toward building a socialist society, how we can work on transitioning out of greed and profits. But after looking over her page, after reviewing some of the things that she said to my very good friend Dakota Lilly, a very, very good guy, based on all of that, I thought, this isn't what I want to do. You can't take every opportunity, right? And I just looked at all of this and I thought, not what I want to do. So my best wishes to her and all of her supporters. I don't agree with her on China and on a number of other points, but, whatever. Matthew Jones says, can you comment on Christianity in China and the persecution of some people in that society? It's hard to believe what I hear in light of all of that. Oh, well, that's a big super chat, and I do love super chats, so thank you, Matthew Jones. And I will answer your question, because there's a lot there. I actually wrote an entire article about China and the government's relationship with religion, etc. There's a lot of good scholarship on this, because you generally will get, when it comes to the situation of religion in China, you will get two points of view in American media. You will get one point of view, which is just bombastic propaganda, which is, all Christians are killed, and, there's actually a song that was on the radio in the 70s. There are Christians in Russia. They meet underground. In China, they're killed when they're found. That's propaganda. There are churches in China. I've heard some statistics say that there are more people attending church in China on Sunday morning than in the United States, which China's population is much bigger than the United States. So that would make sense. And that at this point, the Vatican and China are on the verge of establishing relations, right? The Chinese Catholic Church, which originally was disavowed by the Vatican, has been recognized. All kinds of priests that were appointed by the Chinese government to oversee Catholicism in China are now recognized by the Vatican. I wrote an entire article, and in fact, in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, you can read an entire article on the history of the Catholic Church's relationship with Russia and China, the geopolitics of Catholicism. And it's fascinating, folks. It's very fascinating. You can read about how the Catholic Church, I bet you didn't know this, has always opposed capitalism. Before Karl Marx wrote anything against capitalism, already many popes had spoken against capitalism. However, the Catholic Church was very, very anti-Soviet. But then, in the 60s, the Catholic Church was very key in opposing the Vietnam War. And that you can understand the geopolitics and and the evolving relationship of the Catholic Church and its relationship with Russia and China. You can understand it if you read the article in this book, which I wrote. It was an article I wrote before it was republished in this book where I talked about all of this. But in regards to China and Christians in China, so here's the thing, right? At the time of the Chinese Revolution, there was widespread Roman Catholic faith in China. At the time of the Chinese Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party took power, and it created 3 associations that were religious associations. They created an Islamic association, they created a Buddhist association, and they created a Christian association. These were associations of religious people that were aligned with the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party, still to this day, I believe the Chinese Communist Party does maintain that you must be an atheist to be a real communist, right? And that they maintain dialectical materialism is their basis, and that one must be a solid, hard materialist in order to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. But what makes it interesting, right? They had a revolution in Russia. Prior to the Russian Revolution, there had been a state church, right? The Tsar was also kind of the Pope. He was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, right? Cuba had been a Catholic country, and it had Catholicism as the state religion. Well, it was a little bit different in China, because in China, you did have Catholicism, you did have Buddhism, you did have Islam in some parts of China, but for the most part, most of China practiced what was vaguely referred to as, quote-unquote, Chinese religion, which was local gods and deities, polytheism, right? Local landlords would have gods. The peasantry would be forced to bow before these gods, before these statues. And the first thing that Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, did, one of his first acts was to go to one of these temples where a group of peasants was being forced to bow before these statues and stand up and go and smash the statues and say, this is humiliation, right? This is embarrassing, right? In the West, they have science, but this is humiliation. You're being degraded. This is holding China back. You're better than this. And the KMT movement, this is before the communists, mind you. This is before the Communist Party. The KMT movement was very anti-religious, right? Because it viewed religion as an embarrassment. They were trying to modernize China. They were trying to make China into a modern scientific country, and they hated religion. The KMT was very anti-religious. So the Communist Party, which emerged within the movement that had given birth to KMT, was even more anti-religious because they were in Marxist materialism. In the 1950s, when the communists came to power, however, they had a relationship with the Catholics, with the Buddhists, with the Muslims, with other forms of Christianity. It was during the Cultural Revolution, right? The period that they call the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four, Lin Biao. That was when the Chinese Communist Party became very, very anti-religious, right? Technically, even during the Cultural Revolution, it was legal to be a Christian in China. But they found ways of basically punishing you if you were. For example, Catholic priests in China during the Cultural Revolution were forced to get married. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party had a policy that they wanted to increase China's population. So Catholic priests, because they were celibate, being celibate was anti-communist. It was you were actively working against the party. If you were getting up and saying, I'm celibate, and the Communist Party is actively trying to populate the country, they said that was anti-communism and you could go to jail for it, right? So they forced Catholic priests, they forced Buddhist monks to get married, right? That was a thing that went on. And if you were celibate, you could go to jail for being celibate, right? Because that was working against the communist policy of trying to increase the population. Stuff like that was being done. They talk about public humiliation trials. There's a famous picture during the Cultural Revolution of a Buddhist monk, and he's forced by the Red Guards to stand with a sign that says, Buddhism is dog farts. That was his humiliation, right? It was considered that Buddhism, Christianity, all of this stuff, and eventually even Confucianism, right? After the fall of Lin Biao, the Gang of Four launched their campaign against Confucius, who is like central. Confucius is like central to Chinese civilization, right? And they launched, criticized Lin Biao, criticized Confucius during the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, there was this all-out attempt to make any ideology, any religion, anything that was seen to be not in line with the Chinese Communist Party's beliefs, to just eradicate it. That was the feeling. And it went very far, and they destroyed a lot of ancient temples. They destroyed a lot of ancient mosques in the Islamic Uyghur regions. They did all kinds of stuff. But what's weird is you'll notice, like, for example, Tibet separatists will try to make this about imperialism or something. They'll be like, oh, the Han Chinese came to Tibet and destroyed our ancient temples. Well, they were destroying ancient temples in other parts of China as well. So that's a misnomer, right? The Uyghur separatists will say, oh, the Han Chinese came and destroyed our ancient temples, our ancient Islamic mosques. Well, actually, a lot of the people that were destroying those mosques were Uyghurs, and a lot of the people that were destroying those Tibetan Buddhist temples that were ancient and those ancient monasteries and stuff, a lot of them were Tibetans. It was a China-wide campaign to wipe out anything not communist. And one of the main targets was Confucianism. And the Cultural Revolution, the idea was we are going to purge China of anything that's not communist, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Confucianism. We are just going to purge it all. Communism will be unquestioned. And then the Gang of Four, but then this is where it gets weird, right? Because the Gang of Four didn't really believe in Marxism either. The Gang of Four believed that you could transition to the highest stage of communism in poverty. Right? So they believed all that stuff Karl Marx said about dialectical materialism and economics. They chucked it. No, we can have pure communism even when most of the country doesn't have electricity. Right? So the Gang of Four, it was an awful period. And when Deng Xiaoping arrested the Gang of Four, that was a huge moment of celebration because the Gang of Four had presided over this prolonged period of chaos where people were terrified. And I talked about that. If you watch my class, Mao and American Socialists, I talked about that at great length. So then when Deng Xiaoping came in, there was kind of a reopening of some old questions. At that point, when Deng Xiaoping came in, when the old questions were being opened, the Chinese government published a paper, a position paper on the issue of religion. And interestingly, the position paper that they published on the issue of religion criticized how they had acted in the past, said they needed to repair old relationships. And now, there is an effort. If you read President Xi and his speech to China's religious associations and all of that, the Chinese Communist Party very much wants to have Christians be part of their society. They very much want to have Buddhists be part of their society. And in fact, in the Uyghur regions and in Tibet, the Chinese government is pouring millions and millions of dollars into building mosques and building Tibetan monasteries. So it's complicated. It's not as simple as you would believe. Now, in some regions, I know they had a ban on churches having crosses in front of them because it violated some kind of city code or something. And there was a whole thing going on where, they would demand that the cross be taken off the front of the church. They said that, all the symbolism on display had to be in line with the party line, and something like that was going on. And there were some protests around that, and there was some buildings where the government came and took the crosses down, and it's an ongoing thing, and it's not the same in every region. China is a huge country. You have to understand, China is a very, very big country. Very big country. And the way policies are enforced is different in different regions. Furthermore, you have to understand also that a lot of, and this is a thing that people want to gloss over this, right? I've been to Iran a number of times, and Christianity is widely practiced in Iran. I attended church on Sunday morning, Armenian Christian church in Iran. It was beautiful. It was great. Women don't even have to wear headscarves in the church. They can have communion wine, alcohol. It's illegal in the rest of Iran, but inside a church, you have your fence around it, you can have your communion wine, right? However, in Iran, you will read reports on the internet about, oh, this person was arrested for being a Christian in Iran. Oh, this person is fun, but you read about it. They're fundamentalist Baptists, usually, right? They're pro-Israel. In Iran, it's illegal to be pro-Israel. In China, you can be pro-Israel. But there is a whole pattern of missionaries who do CIA work. That's well documented, right? Mormon missionaries, fundamental Baptist missionaries. The first person to die in the Cold War was John Birch, right? That's why the far right formed this thing called the John Birch Society. In China, there was a guy named John Birch who was a missionary. I don't know what his religion was. I think he might have been a Baptist. But he was doing CIA work, from what I understand, and the Chinese government executed him when they took power. They gave him the death penalty, right? And the way that that's told to Americans is, oh, he was killed for being a Christian. No, he wasn't killed for being a Christian. And a lot of these evangelical groups, Mormons, they're not evangelicals, they're their own thing, but fundamental Baptists, Pentecostals, a lot of them do CIA informing. A lot of missionary groups, are doing a cover for CIA stuff. And so we'll get a report in the United States that they were just persecuted for being a Christian, but you look a little bit deeper, there's a lot going on there. Cuba never banned religion. And in fact, I remember I went to an event where the sister, I believe, of Raul Castro, Mariela Castro, she spoke, and I remember, one of the people in the audience asked who in Cuba is against gay marriage, and she said Baptists. Right? There's a huge number of Cubans who have converted to fundamental baptism. They've become fundamentalist, born-again, evangelical Baptists. It's a big number, and they are very opposed to Cuba having gay marriage. And in fact, it's probably because of fundamentalist Baptist influence. It's probably because of the Baptists, the Southern Baptists of Cuba, that gay marriage is not legal in Cuba. The Cuban government is very pro-LGBT. At this point, they have pro-gay, stuff in school. They provide free transgender surgery to anyone who wants it. But Neon Noir is asking me about China and economic development, and I mean, anyone who has been there recently has been telling me that everything you think you know about China becomes wrong in a few years. Right? You're asking me about third-tier cities and all of that. One thing that was all over U.S. media about China was air pollution. Air pollution. It's so awful. The air pollution in China, it's unbelievable. Well, now you go to Shanghai, you go to some other cities, they actually have an app. I kid you not, an app to measure air quality. And they have worked really, really hard to change that, right? And that these things that people assume that they know. But yeah, there has been persecution of Christians in China historically, and there still might be issues. But at this point, the Vatican recognizes the Communist Party-aligned Catholic Church of China, and there are more people attending church on Sunday morning in China than in the United States at this point, and it's not as simple as you think. It's always more complicated. I am sure that fundamental Baptists, that Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, are going to have a hell of a hard time in China. I don't know if they're legal, but if they're illegal, they're still watched like crazy because people know who they're associated with. However, Catholicism is pretty widespread and tolerated and sanctified by the government. So it's not as simple as you think, right? It's not as simple as you think. In Iran, yes, people get arrested for being, in religious groups that are pro-Israel. But the Armenian Christian Church is an institution in Iran. The Ayatollah even sends them a Christmas greeting every year, right? So it's more complicated than you think. That's all I can say about that. And it's different in different regions, too. Like I told you, in some regions, they've given churches difficulty because of the cross. One thing that I think is fascinating, and it's also really just exposes it, is there is a cult in China called Eastern Lightning. I don't know if folks have ever heard of Eastern Lightning. I've heard of them because their YouTube ads have come up on my YouTube feed. I was going to watch a YouTube video, and all of a sudden there's an advertisement about this church called Eastern Lightning. Well, Eastern Lightning is a Christian, cult in China, and they worship a woman who they believe is the second coming of Jesus Christ, and she lives now in New York City. And Eastern Lightning is illegal in China. It's illegal because of some of their practices. One of the practices of Eastern Lightning, one of the biggest scandals, was in a McDonald's in China. The Eastern Lightning people were handing out leaflets, and a father would not allow his daughter to take a leaflet from these Eastern Lightning people. So these Eastern Lightning people killed him, murdered him, right? And of course they were arrested, given the death penalty, and that China has basically declared Eastern Lightning is unacceptable. So Eastern Lightning has set up shop in Brooklyn, I believe. Brooklyn or Manhattan or Queens or someplace like that. And this woman who claims to be Jesus, she does barely any speaking, which is odd. Her husband, who's the head of the church, represents her to the media and gives all these speeches. And they are this anti-communist cult right? It's kind of like Falun Gong or Falun Dafa. You have Eastern Lightning, right? So, I mean, are Eastern Lightning people tolerated in China? Absolutely not. It's illegal to be Eastern Lightning. Why? They're a fundamentalist, extremist cult that murders people and is trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, and they're not allowed. Can you be Catholic in China? Sure, right? And I've even heard that some of these religions in China that are not tolerated are kind of tolerated. That's the other thing, that maybe they're not officially recognized as a religion. However, people have church in their living room and there's no problem with it, right? I've heard about that too, that there's an understanding, well, if you're not officially recognized as a religion, okay, you can't have a building, you can't like set up as an officially designated religion like 501c3 or whatever we have in the USA, or whatever the Chinese equivalent of that is. But you can have church in your living room. There you go. So there you go. It's not as simple as people make it out to be, and that's how these things tend to be. And that people often will go, no, it's totally illegal, or it's more complicated. Brian Tvet, friend out in Long Island, says People's Republic has never been against Catholic religious doctrine per se, and that's true. Except during the Cultural Revolution, it's pretty clear some bad things were done, and it was never officially illegal to be a Christian or a Buddhist or any of that. But during the Cultural Revolution, it was pretty much, if you were anything but a Maoist, a Maoist communist, you were going to have a problem. But that was wrong, and the Chinese Communist Party has repudiated that period as a dark period, and all of that. And now, Confucianism, which was widely attacked during the Cultural Revolution, they had this whole campaign, criticize Lin Biao, criticize Confucius. Well, now the Chinese Communist Party argues, and you can watch this in the presentation by my good friend Wen Hongyu, who I'm going to interview soon. But Wen Hongyu, in his presentation, he talked about how now the Chinese Communist Party argues that Confucian ideas influenced Marxism, and that in a lot of ways, the Marxist understanding of world history, dialectical materialism, has roots in some Confucian ideas, if you really go way back. And that there's actually a quote from Confucius where he talks about the ideal world, and he talks about how he himself was hoping that humanity could get to this ultimate goal. What is the involvement of Reef Hoffman and Tara McGowan in Shadow App Pete's Connection? I don't know enough about that specifically, and I don't want to get into that. But I do thank you for the super chat. It was very, very appreciated. And there's been a lot written about the Shadow App and all of that. And I don't want to get into that too much on here. But thank you for the super chat. I do appreciate it. People are calling him Mayor Cheat. What I think is wild is that Pete Buttigieg's father is a communist, but not really. His father's a Gramsci scholar. His father is somebody who hung out with Bertrand Russell, I believe. And, there's that whole cultural Marxism milieu. I don't want to say cultural Marxism because that's like an alt-right kind of thing, but there is this understanding that that his father hung out with with the Gramsci scholars and Bertrand Russell, and was really into cultural transformation. But is that stuff really Marxism? I think that that's kind of like Adorno. It's kind of like the Frankfurt School. At that point, it's kind of using Marxism as a vehicle for cultural criticism. It's like Susan Sontag. They don't really want to create a socialist society. They kind of just want to criticize capitalism and criticize capitalist art. I wouldn't say Pete Buttigieg's father is really a communist. I think he's a scholar and academic who understands Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, more than anybody. Donnie Wallace wants me to run for president. Well, I thank you, Donnie. I don't have any political aspirations at this time, but I really do appreciate that. But I will use Donnie Wallace, your invitation to open up a very, very important conversation that I want to talk about. So, Donnie, I'm not running for president. I'm not. I don't have any political aspirations at this time. Furthermore, as a journalist, I'm required to be politically neutral. I can't be, favoring one candidate or the other. I want to give, an objective, clear view in my journalism and my analysis, my political analysis. However, one thing that I've realized is that in the United States at this time, socialism is more popular than ever. Marxism is more popular than ever. Communism is more popular than ever, but no one knows anything about it. No, seriously. I have spent my entire adult life studying Marxism, studying communism, learning all this stuff, and I have discovered that people in the United States know absolutely nothing about it. And I've been giving classes, and I was working with that Students and Youth for a New America for a while, but now I'm ready to move on to something much, much more important. I'm working with some other people, and we have established the Center for Political Innovation, CPI, and we are going to have our official launch on April 18th. There's a beautiful hotel in Weehawken, New Jersey that has been reserved. We have a very big conference room in that hotel. Weehawken, New Jersey, by the way, is just over the bridge from Manhattan. You can see Manhattan, you can see the ocean, right next to Lincoln Harbor, beautiful. And we are going to launch the Center for Political Innovation on April 18th. And what I want for that launch is for you to be there. And you can register right down below, right? Register. The registration link is there below. The website, cpi-usa.org. That's our website. And you should attend. You should come. Right? There's a suggested donation. If you can afford it, that would be great. If not, and you still can make it, that'd be great. And it's not going to be live. It won't be live streamed. There'll be video afterwards, but it won't be live streamed. But it's going to be a great conference. Now, not only I'll be there, and it's my event mainly. I'm the main one coordinating it. I know David Fox says he's coming from all the way from Australia. There's a crew coming from Michigan. There's a crew coming from Florida. There's a crew coming from Boston. There's going to be a lot of people there. It's going to be full of a lot of people. But I want you there in particular because you're here with us doing this weekend political chat thing, and I would like to have you there. However, it's not just going to be me, right? So a good friend of mine who is a folk singer will be providing the music. Another good friend of mine, Dr. Wilmer Leon, who is a radio host. He's on Sirius XM. He's on Sputnik Radio. He will be speaking. Manar Muhawish, who is the editor of Mint Press News. She will be speaking and giving a great address. Just recently, we got a confirmation from Randy Nord, who is the editor of Geopolitics Alert. She is going to be there as well. It's going to be a great event. It's going to be great. And there'll be other folks. I mean, some folks I work with, some of the students I work with will present. And the MC is going to be a really, really clever, funny, witty stand-up comedian from Illinois. Her name is Pubali. She's hilarious. She is going to be chairing the whole thing. It's going to be a great event. We got 3 big panels that we're going to have. You will learn about geopolitics. You will learn about Marxism, you'll learn about socialism, you'll learn about world events and world history and the global economy. And on top of that, you will be part of an important project, right? CPI, the Center for Political Innovation, this is where I'm giving my free time, lots of my own resources. I am dedicated to spreading socialist education throughout the United States. People need to know what's going on. And there's a lot of malarkey out there about socialism, a lot of stuff that is just not accurate. So we are launching a very important project. The Center for Political Innovation, we are going to publish books, right? We are going to convene conferences all over the country. We want to do one on the West Coast in the fall. That's our aim. And so I want you to talk about early Arab philosophy and did it possibly inspire the rise of Adam Smith? Well, that's interesting. I can see that, right? Because, you talk about, Sunni and Shia. You talk about the imams and the merchants who killed the imams. You talk about the trader class that emerged in the Islamic Empire. You talk about all of that, and you can definitely see the beginnings of free trade and all of that. I can certainly see that. And thank you, Sami, for the super chat. And I know what you're talking about. I can definitely see that. And what's interesting is I think one of the texts that probably points toward that more than anything that I read is Thomas Carlyle. He wrote On Heroes and the Heroic in History. Thomas Carlyle is a Scottish intellectual. He has an entire chapter about the Prophet Muhammad and how the Prophet Muhammad is an influence on Western civilization, how the Prophet Muhammad himself was probably influenced by Christianity. I'm sure those who are Muslims wouldn't agree with what Thomas Carlyle said, but as far as what you said, Sami, about the Muslim world and the mercantile class that emerged and early Arab philosophy and its influence on Adam Smith, I'm sure Thomas Carlyle would agree with you. And I read that book and I learned a lot from it. And it's a fascinating work. It really is, where he gets into that. And he was speaking, this book was published in like the early 1800s. And he's a Scottish professor and an academic. And he's speaking to an audience of British people in the 1800s. And he's telling them all about Muhammad and why they should be interested in Muhammad. I think it's fascinating. Shout out to a good friend of mine, George, who did pass that Thomas Carlyle book on to me. It's very powerful stuff. One of the most poetic things that I found in that Thomas Carlyle book is he talks about how, does your org accept donations? Absolutely. There's a donate button on the page. Absolutely. We need donations. Thomas Carlyle, in his book, one of the things he points out is he says, you go to the Old Testament of the Bible, you go to the New Testament, you go to, Muhammad and Islam, all the great prophets of history, according to Thomas Carlyle, and it's true if you look at it, all the great prophets of history tend to destroy idols and idol worship, right? It's one thing that they do, right? Moses destroys the golden calf. Isaiah says they shall cast away their idols of gold and idols of silver and worship him above, right? This seems to be like a theme. Why are all these, religious figures throughout history, prophetic individuals, coming forward and destroying idols, right? Well, according to Thomas Carlyle, in his analysis, what he's saying is that, we really shouldn't assume that ancient people were stupid. We shouldn't, right? When they talk about a fetish or an idol, right? That ancient people built some little statue and thought it was God. Ancient people were not stupid. They knew that if they carved up a piece of wood or they carved something out of stone, they carved something out of metal, that it wasn't God. These statues represented principles, right? But when the prophets showed up and cast away the idols, what they were casting away was routinism, because at that point, instead of worshiping and adhering to the principles that those statues and those idols and those fetishes had stood for, these folks were in a routine. They were in a rut. They had their little fetish, their little idol, and they were kind of bowing before it. And the principles, the higher truths that these images, these idols, these graven images had once stood for, had vanished. And the prophets were those who returned to reassert those truths, to tell people to stop going through the motions and worshiping the idols, but instead to believe in the higher principles and truths that those statues and idols and graven images once stood for. And that's a common theme all over the world. You will see that great leaders, right, like Dr. Sun Yat-sen, what's one of the first things he does? He goes and destroys idols, right? That prophets, leaders, revolutionaries are those who come and destroy routine, and they destroy glibism, and they destroy things that have no meaning, and they restore passion and principles to the earth. That's what these great people of history, you want to call them prophets, you want to call them revolutionaries, you want to call them, that's what they do, is they destroy the routine, they destroy the hypocrisy, they destroy the fetishism, the idolatry, and they replace it with truth. That's what they do. And that was a great point that Thomas Carlyle makes. And he makes it, I believe that's in the chapter on the Prophet Muhammad, in his book, the role of heroism in history or whatever. On heroes, hero worship, and the role of heroes in history, right? Is that they destroy the routinism and they restore the principles. And I said in my class on the actual nature of revolution that I would like every young person who gets into Marxism and socialism to be a kind of prophet of Marxism. Because the Marxist movement, as it currently exists, with the SWP and the ISO and the RCP and the QWH and the PSL and the XYZ and the, and the Fourth International and the Third International and the Fifth and the Eighth and the 12th International, it is a mess of idolatry. It is a mess of fetishism. It is a mess of worship of idols. And that we need young people to tear down these routines, to tear down these idols, to tear down these fetishes, and restore the principles, the revolutionary principles, the traditions of fighting for science and opposing injustice that the socialist and Marxist movement once stood for. To restore the passion and truth that once existed in the Marxist movement. And sometimes, in order to restore the truth that the statue once stood for, you have to destroy the idol that has become meaningless, right? And that is what I would like young people to do. I would like young people not to announce on the internet that they are a follower of Enver Hoxha and erect a little, fetish of Enver Hoxha in their bedroom and study Enver Hoxha's writings religiously and feel like they're important. I would like young people instead to study Enver Hoxha's writings, study the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, study the writings of Marx and Lenin, and wrangle with them and come to understand the radical principles in these writings and build something new and beautiful for our time that is not a routine idol worship, but is instead loaded with passion and truth. That's what I would like to do. I mean, that's what I would like to do with CPI. I am not interested in being an ist, right? I mean, I am interested in socialism for the 21st century. I'm interested in studying all of the great revolutionary leaders. And at the same time, I'm interested in criticizing all of them. And thank you for your solidarity. I saw that I got some solidarity from someone. I saw someone who said they will come, and that's great. Be there. I mean, the Center for Political Innovation is very exciting. I haven't been this excited in a long time. Seriously, I have not been this excited in a long time, right? And this is not, we're not campaigning for anybody, right? I mean, folks know I have some criticism of Bernie Sanders. We're going to talk about that later. In fact, why don't we talk about that now? Folks, I don't know if folks realize this, but I believe in 2015, I wrote an article that was very harshly critical of Bernie Sanders. Now, I think the tone of that article was not right. I think the facts in that article are undisputed, and my criticism of Bernie Sanders when it comes to foreign policy and some other things remains. But I also think that the Bernie Sanders movement is like one of the most exciting things happening in the United States right now. The people that I meet in it are full of hope and optimism, the best people, so I wrote that article. I shouldn't have written it the way I did, but recalling the time period in which I wrote that article and how I was feeling, recalling how I felt maybe a decade before that, forced me to realize something. And I'm going to say it to you all. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to try not to offend anybody in the process of saying it. But we all love drama, right? But I'm going to try to give you as little drama. And thank you, Ramiro, for your comment earlier. Folks, I remember when I was living in Cleveland. I was an activist in Cleveland. I was involved in a lot of stuff around the issue of police brutality, long before the issue of police brutality was quote unquote trendy, right? Back when police brutality was not on the front pages, right? This is way before Baltimore. This is way before Trayvon Martin. There was a lot of police brutality in Cleveland. I had the honor of working with folks in an organization called Black on Black Crime Incorporated in Cleveland, which is kind of a black nationalist group that does amazing work. Art McCoy and others. And there were some police brutality cases, and I was in the local press. There's articles about me, the communist next door, and you can read about stuff that I did. I'm not going to get into great detail about what went on, but I was doing a lot of activism. And I remember on one particular day, I went to a police brutality rally, and I spoke. fired up the crowd. You know, that's what you do when you're an activist, right? And you're firing up the crowd. I love doing that. So, you know, I did that. And there was a couple people in the audience who said, Caleb for mayor, Caleb for mayor. Like they wanted me to run for mayor, right? So I remember I got into the car afterwards with two of my comrades, two young people that were also in the socialist group I was in. You know, we're driving away from the rally. And I said to them, just thinking, I wasn't even like, you know, I said, hey, you think it could be possible I could actually be mayor of Cleveland? You know, and I hadn't thought this through. It was just, I was just throwing it out there because these people at this rally had said Caleb for mayor. And I remember, you know, I was in the car with two different people, a man and a woman, a young person who was male, a young person who was female. And, you know, they were both unbelievably hostile to me. You know, sarcasm, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Oh my God, why would you ever think that a communist could be elected mayor of a city? Unbelievable, that's so stupid. They're completely hostile to me. And I said, well, guys, I'm not saying I'm going to do it. I just thought of it, you know, just something that occurred to me. Oh my God, they were, you wouldn't believe the hostility that these two people unloaded on me. And I just kind of paused for a moment. You know, the funny thing is, I remember that. That's well over a decade ago. Where are those two people? I mean, I'm not going to get into detail about their lives because I don't want to embarrass them, but they ain't doing very much. They ain't doing very much. Meanwhile, I moved to New York City. I work for an international TV network. I fly over the world. I've got, you know, I mean, well, there you go. But then let's fast forward, right? Let's fast forward, right? A decade later, I was in a certain socialist group. I was trying really hard to build that socialist group. I was very frustrated with the fact the socialist group just didn't want to grow. It was like they just couldn't expand. It was like impossible. There were all these opportunities, all these people were getting interested in socialism, but they just couldn't bring themselves to recruit. And I recruited people, and they drove them away, and I was just so effing frustrated. I was just really frustrated. I just could not believe how difficult it was to build the group. So 2015, we have the very beginning of the Bernie Sanders movement. And I was just filled with rage at the Bernie Sanders movement because I had been spending every waking hour of my life trying to build a socialist group. And I saw on TV this guy is talking about socialism. I mean, he doesn't agree with me about some pretty key foreign policy stuff. He doesn't even agree with me about the definition of socialism. You know, and he's got thousands of people there. All right. And I was furious. And one of the main disagreements I had with this group is that they had it in their minds that you should never preach socialism to anyone, that you just have to be an activist, a real activist, and you have to like recruit people covertly or something. And they were constantly suppressing me and preventing me from giving speeches. And you know, it was what it was, right? And they didn't like me writing for their newspaper after a while, and it was complicated, right? And so I was frustrated, and I saw Bernie Sanders on TV with these huge crowds, and I was thinking, God damn it, why can't my political organization have these big crowds? So I was hostile to Bernie Sanders in ways I shouldn't have been. But on top of that, my group was actually discussing, you know, endorsing Bernie Sanders. And I was furious. I was thinking, my goodness, so not only are we not going to go out and preach socialism ourselves, we're going to endorse somebody who does it wrong. I was furious. And I wrote an article, or an internal like email in part of the discussion. And I wrote this internal email, and I said, you know, I said, I blame the party for this. I said, you know, we should be the ones with huge crowds. We should be the ones with huge crowds talking about socialism, not Bernie Sanders. And of course, you know, in this group, there's this atmosphere that if you disagree, you're being quote unquote uncomradely. It's disrespectful. And so I was in huge trouble after I wrote an email criticizing the party. And I remember one of these women who called me up, who was a leader of the group, called me up on the phone and was going over this email I had sent and how disrespectful and uncomradely it was. And one of the things she said to me was, she said, you think that we could be as big as Bernie Sanders? She said, that's ridiculous. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever thought. And I said to this person, I said, really? I said, aren't we supposed to eventually take power? Aren't we supposed to eventually become the ruling party of the United States? Yeah. And I realized at that moment that my suspicions were correct, right? Just like these people in the car with me thought the notion that I could ever be that we could ever have a socialist mayor in Cleveland was ridiculous. Just like this person, 10 years later, thought the notion that their socialist group could ever be as big as the Bernie Sanders movement was ridiculous. These people had given up, right? They didn't have big aspirations, right? Now, I am all in favor of being realistic, of having accomplishable goals, of setting short-term goals versus long-term goals. But if you want to survive, you have to aim high. If you want to survive, you have to aim high. I don't just think this applies to politics. I think it applies to everything else we're doing in the world, right? If you want to survive, you have got to aim high. Right? And where is that socialist group that I was in at that point, that I devoted all this energy to? Where are they now? Well, I mean, there's been how many splits now? Quite a few splits, some like fist fights and infighting and all kinds of allegations of assault. And yeah, well, they didn't aim high, and they're lower than ever. Right? And where are those people who were in that car with me who thought it was ridiculous that I would ever be the mayor of Cleveland? Well, I'm not the mayor of Cleveland. I've never been elected to public office, but I kept going because I could aim high. Where are they now? Right? The socialist group that thought it was ridiculous that they could ever be as big as Bernie Sanders. Where are they now? Crashing and burning, If you want to survive, you have got to aim high. If you don't have big aspirations, right? If you don't have big principles and beliefs, if you're not trying to grow, you're going to die. And that applies to every aspect of human life. If you want to survive, you have got to aim high. All right? That is a Maupinism that you can quote from here to the moon. All right? If you want to survive, you have got to aim high. And I learned that, right? I have gotten where I am today, and I continue to do what I'm doing because I continue to aim high. Right? I have big aspirations. I believe in truth. I want to change the world. Right? And, if you can aim high, I think a lot of people have in the back of their head this voice that as soon as they come up with like a big aspiration, right? They think I could open my own business, or I could start my own website, or I could do, and they have this voice in the back of their head that says you could never do that. Everyone's going to laugh at you. You're going to fail. You're awful. And that voice is their greatest enemy. I swear, And I know so many people who have that voice, right? This voice in the back of their head that says, you could never do this. You're never going to be successful. You are a fool. You know what I'm saying? And people have it, right? And that voice in the back of their head keeps them from aiming high. And that is their greatest enemy. And the struggle to make that voice that they have in their head go away is one of the most important things you can do. You have to learn to aim high. Shoot for the stars, right? Keep your feet on the ground. Don't go crazy, but shoot for the stars. It's the only way you can get by in this world, I'm telling you. And thank you, Sami. No diet beverage tonight. We're just doing water tonight because it's late already. But there you go, right? I mean, there's that beautiful song that I like, from the Broadway show, Dream the Impossible Dream, about, it's beautiful stuff. Dare to struggle and dare to win. There you go, And so, yes, I don't ever see myself running for office. There are reasons for that I can get into at some point. I don't even really want to be involved in the political process at this point, right? I have to remain neutral in order to do my journalism, in order to keep my objectivism real, my analysis objective. No objectivism here. No Ayn Rand stuff here. But no, in order to keep my analysis objective, in order to do what I do, I need to not be campaigning for people or endorsing people or anything like that. But I can teach the truth about socialism. I can agitate the agitators. I can inspire, and that is something I struggle to do. And I would like to bring other people forward to do it as well. I would like you to give classes. I would like you to write articles. I want to maximize your potential. All these socialist groups out there, the first thing you learn when you join is you better ask permission, and your job is to shut up and glorify the leaders. That's not how I want to do it. I want to find your potential and expand it. I think that you have the capacity to become a great socialist. I really do. And I would really, really like to expand that potential within you. I think you have the ability to do great things, and I would like to help you to do that, right? So there you go. Yeah. So there you go. What else is on people's minds, right? I got the super chats coming in. I got a few things we can talk about. Folks, I don't know if folks noticed that Mitt Romney was the only Republican to vote for Donald Trump to be impeached. Donald Trump, and I will get to Nepal. There was a request I talk about Nepal, so thank you for that. I'm going to talk about it. But there was a call for the impeachment vote. And the only Republican that voted to impeach, to convict Donald Trump, voted for him to be removed from office, was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is the U.S. Senator from Utah. And I wrote an article about that. And that article is available on my website. I've tweeted it out. It's important, right? Because you need to understand that Mitt Romney doesn't only represent himself. Mitt Romney is the de facto spokesperson for what I've been calling the Mormon axis. And that is centered around Salt Lake City. There's an axis of power within the U.S. government, within the U.S. deep state apparatus. And Mormons are one of the top religions among FBI, top religions among CIA. Glenn Beck is a Mormon, right? And that they have a lot of power, right? And that there's articles about why Mormons make great FBI agents, why Mormons make great CIA, right? And you'll remember in the 2016 election, Evan McMullen, who's a ex-CIA professor, big name Mormon out in Utah, was on the ballot in the state of Utah. And the Mormons were not going to vote for Trump. You remember that? They were not going to vote for Trump. They were going to vote for Evan McMullen. But you'll remember, about a week before the elections, Evan McMullen and most of the Mormons all voted for Trump. They were all suddenly pro-Trump. Furthermore, you'll notice that around that same time, the FBI, with a lot of Mormons in it, reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton. Right? And you'll notice that Glenn Beck even changed his tune and endorsed Trump. It's complicated. Can we talk more about how we move out of the movement and into the masses? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. I'll get to that. Thank you, David. But the Mormon axis, right? It's very important to understand, right? Mormonism is very, very weird, right? I mean, all religion, you could call it weird, but this is a religion that was started here in the United States. You had this guy in upstate New York who said he found golden plates and was visited by angels, and he believed in polygamy, and they kept moving further west, and eventually they set up Salt Lake City, and they call it New Zion, the Kingdom of New Zion. You read about it, it's very interesting, and it actually parallels what you could call the mystery cults of ancient Rome. So within ancient Rome, there was the official religion of Roman society. They worshiped Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. But there was this trend they called mystery cults, right? Among Roman Navy, they had a special god and a special religion for people that were involved in naval stuff. There was the cult of Mithras, right? And that was people within the Roman government structure that worshipped a kind of Roman reinterpretation of Zarathustra, the ancient Persian prophet. You had the cult of Isis, right? That was a religion, Isis is the ancient god of Egypt, and it was imported, and you had a lot of prominent Romans who, and these mystery religions, what was interesting is that most people didn't understand them. They had to be initiates to practice them, right? And their beliefs were actually, reserved only for members, right? It was almost like the Freemasons or something like that, right? And that, the cult of Mithras had 7 layers of initiation, right? And so you didn't, you had to go through 7 layers of initiation. Only the people who got all the way through the 7 layers knew exactly what was believed by the followers of Mithras, right? And that these religions weren't for the broad masses of people, but within the government structure, certain mystery cults or mystery religions positioned themselves as being very, very important. If you were in the Roman Navy, there was a mystery cult that was for the high-ranking naval guys. If you were in the Roman Senate, there might have been a certain mystery cult that was high up for the senators. It's a very, very interesting trend, right? And that often, and this is where it's interesting, the people who are the state and the population have to believe very different things, right? Police, for example. Anyone who's got a police officer in their family, they believe stuff that is completely contrary to what everyone else believes. As far as a lot of police are concerned, police brutality is something made up. It's propaganda made up to hurt police. Criminals get away with stuff all the time. All the jails are fun, happy resorts where people watch TV and get massages all day. I've heard police officers say this. They believe this, right? In order to be a police officer and do what police officers do, you have to believe stuff that the rest of the population doesn't believe, right? I mean, and that applies to any society. And that the mystery cults kind of served that, right? What the people that ran the Roman Navy believed, I mean, maybe it was overall the same as what most Romans believed, but they had a special mystery cult that kind of guided them. And Mormonism is a kind of special mystery cult for U.S. intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI. They have a certain set of beliefs. Mormonism is particularly key in what they believe, right? Manifest destiny, right? And the belief that the USA is somehow magic and sacred is a big part of Mormonism, right? They believe Jesus was here on this continent and so, in a way, you can compare Mormonism to the mystery cults of ancient Rome. It's kind of fascinating, right? This is what ISIS was in the Roman Empire, what Mithras was in the in the Roman Empire is basically what Mormonism is. It's a mystery cult for people within the state apparatus, right? That people who have the job of being the U.S. government spy agency or being the FBI are people that they, in order to do their job, they have to believe things that are different than what the most of the population believes, right? Let's be real about it. So they set up kind of a mystery cult. And really, until World War II, the Mormons were really considered to be fringe and not trusted in U.S. society. And it wasn't really until World War II, when the Mormons joined the John Birch Society and they became fanatical anti-communists, that all of a sudden they started to be trusted by the U.S. government. And in the 70s, their missionary work was cooperating with CIA, and they were gathering information around the world. And that's when Mormonism really expanded into what it is today. It was this, for most Americans, nowadays we know what Mormons are, right? We see them, we know about Mitt Romney, who was the Republican nominee. They're a big part of Republican Party politics, big part of neoconservatism. But up until the 50s, there was this weird cult out in Utah that people didn't like, right? But it's changed, right? It's fascinating. And the other thing about Mormons is they are much like the ancient Roman mystery cults in the way that they operate, right? For example, I often will compare them to Jehovah's Witnesses. It's like day and night, right? You talk to a Jehovah's Witness. Talk to a Jehovah's Witness. You see one on the street, they knock on your door. They will tell you everything. You can play 20 questions with them. They will sit there and talk to you about how there's no heaven, but there is the Garden of Eden. It's going to combine with earth. And they will tell you in great detail every theological belief that they have. Those Jehovah's Witnesses will talk to you nonstop. Talk to the Mormons who knock on your door. They won't say any of that. They'll be like, hey, have you ever heard of the Book of Mormon? Okay, yeah, well, what is this about golden plates and all that? They won't go there. They will not go there, right? The Mormon recruiting pitch is, we smile all the time, we're happy, there's a lot of prominent people that are business owners and stuff in our religion, we really believe in family, we're a nice, fun group of people, and we're wholesome and friendly. It's a completely different approach because it's a mystery cult, right? You're not supposed to hear about Joseph Smith and golden plates and all of that until they've already kind of recruited you on a social level. Once it's become your whole social circle, once you're in this group of people, and once you're fully committed, then we'll start talking to you about golden plates and how you're going to get your own planet if you're a good, true believer and all of that stuff, right? And that's more the mystery cult structure. I think it's fascinating, right? That basically, I've made all these analogies to ancient Rome. Well, one analogy is that just like the Roman state had its own mystery cults for its state apparatus, the United States government. Basically, Mormonism has become the mystery cult of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. And the Mormons don't like Trump, right? I mean, the Mormons aren't allowed to say, they aren't allowed to drink, they're not allowed to swear, they're not allowed to have sex outside of marriage. And Donald Trump, I mean, he's a cursing, swearing, I mean, we all know about Donald Trump, right? His personality is like the opposite of the ideal Mormon personality, right? Mormons aren't even allowed to drink coffee, for goodness sakes. So, it's really interesting. It's really an interesting comparison. And I've made that analogy before. Now, I was asked by Daniel Fox, he gave a very nice super chat to talk about, out of the movement to the masses. And I got to tell you, folks, I don't know how much time I want to spend on this, but I spent a lot of time in quote unquote the movement. When I was a left activist, that was every other the movement. What's the movement doing? Where's the movement going? And no one ever really talked about what the movement was. But really what the movement was people who go to left-wing rallies and protest. That's kind of what it was, right? If it was when there's a rally somewhere, when someone gets a permit and has a cage set up and people stand there with bullhorns or carry signs, who shows up at those things? The movement. And it's funny because the guy who invented revisionism, Edward Bernstein, the man who called himself a revisionist, what was his slogan? The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. Meaning the day-to-day protests and struggles, that's what we're all about. And this socialist revolution stuff, this Marxism, this ideology, the movement is everything, but the goal is nothing. And my frustration with the socialist group I was in was that I felt like they felt that way. That was basically what they felt. They felt like the movement was everything. Every other word out of their movement was about the movement. And the goal was nothing. And you talk to a lot of these socialist groups, that's more or less what they believe, right? They, there's certain factions that really want to control the protest movement, right? They want to control the protest cage. They have every permit reserved, and they know how to stage a peaceful, legal rally. Whatever liberals are protesting around, whatever the latest trendy liberal hipster cause is, they're out in front of it. They've got their permit, and they're setting up the cage, and they're printing all the signs. And that's not where I'm at because, there's a lot of problems with that, right? A lot of problems with that. First of all, the first problem with it is the movement represents less than 1% of the U.S. population. Folks, here in New York City, it's a little bit different, right? In New York City, it's people protest. They do, right? It's respected in a weird way. If you're in high school and your teacher might encourage you to go march against education cuts or something. It's a different culture. When I was growing up in Ohio, and even when I went to college near Cleveland, Ohio, there was this attitude that all protesters are mentally ill. Right? That's a lot of Americans believe that if you protest around any issue, if you carry a sign, you are mentally ill. A lot of Americans believe that. And I remember having arguments with people, when the Tea Party got going. You remember that, right? Right after Obama got elected, all the Republicans were protesting. And I knew people that were in the college Republican club who quit being Republicans because they said, I'm not one of those protesters. I'm not going to be a protester. Right? There's this belief that anyone who is politically active in that way, right? It's one thing if you go vote, it's one thing if you write a letter to a member of Congress, but if you go and protest, you're crazy. Well, that's wrong. And I would say to people, Martin Luther King, he protested. There's a national holiday for him. And they would be like, well, that's your opinion, Caleb. I'm like, it's not my opinion. Look at a picture. But it's just, there's a lot of people who have it in their head that all protesters are insane, right? So if your entire strategy is around organizing and controlling protests, the amount of people in the United States who go out and protest is quite small. So you're already aiming pretty low. Number two, now things are even weirder, right? So now there's a little bit more of an uptick in protesting. You have the Women's March, for example, huge anti-Trump mobilizations, right? You have Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street. But, and here's what's weird, if you went to those women's marches against Trump, the folks there are more supportive of the U.S. government, of U.S. imperialist adventurism around the world, of the U.S. military police state apparatus, than Trumpers are. I'm not exaggerating. You go and talk to them. They're really opposed to quote unquote conspiracy theories, right? They are really, really opposed to anyone who doesn't want a war with Russia. They're really, really opposed to people disrespecting our good FBI. And so a lot of the people that are now in the movement are more anti-communist, more pro-US establishment than the people who aren't, right? You go out into average America. A lot of people will tell you that the government is working for the rich people, that the FBI and CIA just do what serves the rich people. They don't care about us, that the wars are a lie. But if you go to the protest cage, if you go to the Women's March, if you go to the rallies to impeach Trump, that's where you get people saying, Trump is disrespecting our FBI. Oh, Russia is our enemy. Russia is the enemy. Right? The movement is more anti-communist, more pro-imperialist than the masses are. So why in the world, in such a situation, and the movement, let me remind you, is less than 1% of the population, why in the world would communists focus on controlling a movement that doesn't agree with them, and instead of going out to the masses? This is why populism is in the hands of the ruling class. That's why populism has been hijacked by the right. This is because anti-populism has infected left-wing circles. I hope this answers your question, Daniel. But really, anti-populism, 1960s leftism, right? 1960s leftism. It was based on a certain place and a certain time, and it made sense then. I'm not saying it was wrong. I mean, it was wrong in some ways, but even in its context, it made sense. You had a booming economy in the United States, booming economy. You had a Vietnam War, you had racism, and there was a section of the kind of middle-class students who said, you know what, we don't want to be good Germans, right? We looked at the history of the Holocaust and how there was a lot of Germans who just kind of went along with it. And right now, our government's committing a Holocaust in Vietnam and killing millions of people. We don't want to be good Germans. We want to take a moral witness, and we're going to get beaten up, and we're going to get spit on, and we're going to go to jail, but we are not going to be good Germans. Well, that's very commendable. That is a very commendable stand to take, right? That's not populism. And Gloria Steinem, let's talk about that. I'm going to write that down. That's very important. Gloria Steinem. All right. That's not populism. That's just not populism. That's anti-populism, right? I remember during the Bush years, there were like 2 movies made about Sophie Scholl. Folks remember Sophie Scholl? She was this German pacifist who got the death penalty. And as World War II was going on, she was passing out leaflets basically urging Germany to sign a surrender treaty. And she got the death penalty. Well, if you talk to a lot of 1960s leftists, Putin, Stalin, that's odd. I'll have to think about how to answer that. I've got you, but a lot of 1960s leftists, you talk to them, they basically think they're Sophie Scholl. They live in an evil empire that's committing holocausts. They're one of the good people. Most of the people in America are mean, scary, sadistic monsters who watch violent movies and they're one of the good people inside the empire, and they're going to take a moral stand, and they're going to be persecuted, and history is going to remember them as one of the good people, and it's a really sad place to live in psychologically, and it's not what we need now. Maybe in the 60s that was the right thing to do, and those people did great things in terms of civil rights organizing, in terms of draft resistance and opposing the Vietnam War. I'm not putting down what they did in that time, but that mindset, that belief that the masses are kind of, it's a lot like Ayn Rand, right? The masses are the mob. They're this dangerous mob of evil people. I'm moral, I have education, and I am going to be persecuted by this mob for my higher truth that I believe in. That's an anti-populist mindset. It's an anti-populist mindset. It just is an anti-populist mindset. And right now, we're in a situation where, the people that the anti-populist 60s leftists think are the mob are more open than ever to hear about socialism. They're voting for Bernie Sanders. They're voting for Trump when he said he was going to drain the swamp and he was going to oppose the war. They're open to hearing this. But if you keep thinking of them as the mob, and it's not, anti-populism needs to be gotten rid of. The movement, what they call the movement coming out of the 60s is loaded with anti-populism, right? I was thinking about the hard hat riots, right? I'll tell this story. Beautiful story. Occupy Wall Street. Right? I remember one night, at Occupy Wall Street. I was on my way to go to Occupy Wall Street. It was a night they said they were going to clear the park, and so all these people were pouring out to support Occupy Wall Street. So it was like, like midnight, and I'm walking toward Occupy Wall Street with a big bundle of signs. And I remember that this car pulled up next to me, and it was some rich Wall Street guy. And he rolled down his window and he shouted at me, "You little hippie, why don't you get a job?" And I just looked at him. And then from behind me, there was like an MTA, like the transit system. There was like a construction site. And all these guys in hard hats were working there. And they turned around. They turned around and shouted at that guy with his window rolled down, insulting me. They shouted, "Oh, F you, you 1% mother effer. These kids are doing the right thing, you piece of shit." And these construction worker guys, big, burly construction worker guys in hard hats working late at night for the MTA, had my back against the Wall Street guy, right? I thought that was pretty neat. I then told this to some of the older radicals that I worked with, and they started crying. They started crying. And do you know why they started crying? Because these folks remembered the hard hat riots. Do folks know what the hard hat riots were? May of 1970. Guys, construction workers, all the construction workers unions in New York City went out and beat the shit out of hippies and anti-war protesters with baseball bats and weapons all over New York City. In Greenwich Village, they started randomly attacking anyone with long hair. And Richard Nixon, the rise of Nixon, and the hard hat riots, it was the construction workers, those guys in construction worker hats who were the most right-wing guys who went around beating up anti-war activists and communists. And so the fact that things had changed. In 2011, during the Occupy Wall Street protests, the construction workers were on the left's side. They were supporting the anti-war protesters. They were supporting Occupy Wall Street. These leftists I knew burst into tears hearing this. But that's because things have changed, folks. Things have changed. Nowadays, guys who work at construction sites are far more likely to agree with Bernie Sanders. Meanwhile, people who go to Harvard and Yale are less likely to agree with Bernie Sanders, right? It used to be SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, was recruiting at Harvard and recruiting at Yale, and they were constantly getting beaten up by construction worker guys who thought they all needed to, go get a haircut or whatever. Well, now, construction worker guys are voting for Bernie Sanders. Construction worker guys, maybe they're listening to Alex Jones, but they are more anti-war, more anti-establishment, and it's the rich people who go to Harvard and Yale and want to get a cabinet appointment in the administration and are reading foreign affairs and understand why we need a war against Vladimir Putin and the Chinese communists, right? It's the elites. It's the elites that are the defenders of the system. And it's the hard hats, right? Those construction worker guys, those average people in the Midwest, they're the ones that are mad at the system. It ain't this is not 1968 anymore. This is not 1970 anymore. This is 2020. It's a different time. And the movement is an anti-populist formation. The movement is a group of people that got beaten up by construction worker guys, right? I mean, the movement, it's a totally different mindset. We have got to get out of the movement and get to the masses. The masses are ready to hear it. The movement is getting worse every day, right? And you talk about Soros money and NGOs and get out of the movement and get to the masses. That's what I got to say. The movement is not everything. The goal is not nothing. The goal is everything. The goal is everything. And the movement only matters if it helps us to reach that goal. And at this point, the movement is an impediment to reaching that goal. That's just a fact. So there you go. I mean, I think that construction worker thing is an important thing. So now I got 2 super chats to get to. Gloria Steinem. Okay, folks, right now, I'm always constantly trying to figure things out and have more of an understanding of geopolitics and all of that. So one thing I've been reading is a biography of the big imperialist strategist, Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? I've referenced him before. He's probably the most key figure in the U.S. defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Just a reprehensible man, right? But a man who really understood communists and knew how to manipulate communists against each other and all of that. But so I'm reading this biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and one thing that I discover is that Zbigniew Brzezinski in college was working like as a junior CIA kind of guy. And who did he work very, very closely with? Gloria Steinem, right? Gloria Steinem is the leading feminist. Well, she was a CIA person. She and Zbigniew Brzezinski were college pals. They worked together, right? They went to Eastern Europe and caused problems in socialist countries. They worked against communist groups on their college campuses. Gloria Steinem, the leading voice of feminism, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the leading anti-communist of the 1970s, were like that. They knew each other for a long time. It's in the biography. Read about it. Well, I learned that, right? And that at the time that Gloria Steinem was becoming a prominent feminist in the 70s, interestingly, there was a group of Maoist feminists called the Red Stockings, and they exposed that she was involved in CIA-funded workshops, trying to foment discontent in Vietnam, her history with the CIA goes way, way back, right? That Gloria Steinem, Zbigniew Brzezinski are kind of the left face of empire. So somebody asked about Gloria Steinem. Fascinating. Read about it, right? I mean, her history as a college student all the way up until she became what she is today, right? And what she really became in like the late 70s. Her whole history was with anti-communist CIA subversion, right? That's her history. That's who she is. As far as Putin and Stalin, I mean, here's the thing. So Putin took office and saved Russia's economy. In the 1990s, Russia had completely free market economics, and it was a disaster. So Putin came in, and he restructured Russia's economy to be centered around oil and gas as national champions, right? Stalin is loved in Russia. Stalin is considered a national hero who defeated the Nazi invaders, who industrialized the Soviet Union. Stalin's very popular. Polls in Russia show that Stalin's a very popular fellow. He made Russia great again, right? And there's a lot of Russians who are not communists who admire Stalin, right? They don't, let's remember Stalin, for example, brought back and legalized the Russian Orthodox Church, right? There's a lot of Russian Orthodox people who hate Lenin because they consider Lenin to be anti-Christian. They love Stalin because Stalin defeated the invaders. Stalin made Russia great again. Stalin, brought back the church. It's complicated, right? What is the relationship between Putin and Stalin? Well, Putin has talked a lot about how, he condemns, atrocities that were committed during the Stalin era. He's been very critical of Stalin. Read what he says about Stalin. He's not a Stalinist. He's not a Marxist-Leninist. Putin is not a Marxist. Absolutely not a Marxist. But at the same time, I guess one could argue that in the fact that he's not like Yeltsin, right? And the fact that he does believe that there should be state control over major centers of economic power, and the fact that he does believe the goal of the government should be to raise living standards in Russia. I guess maybe that's a similarity, but they're two different leaders in two different times, two different worldviews, two different backgrounds. Stalin was not Russian, let's remember. Stalin was Georgian, right? Very different background. And Russia's a very different country now. There's far higher level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in Russia today than there was under Stalin. The Stalin era, despite the fact that real economic miracles happened, was a very hard time. Russia was surrounded and blockaded. It ended up losing 26 million people in the Second World War. It's complicated, right? And that, there is a whole history of like strong Russian leaders who, made Russia more prosperous economically, unified the Eurasia, right? Parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, kind of brought stability to that region. I think a lot of Russians or a lot of Russian political thinkers would put not just Stalin, not just Putin, but a lot of leaders from Russia's history, Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, into this kind of category of like strong leaders who made a strong Russian homeland. And I don't think that means they're the same or they have the same kind of policies or even the same worldviews. Stalin very much believed in dialectical materialism. He legalized the Russian Orthodox Church, but he wasn't religious. Whereas, Putin is very much an Orthodox Christian. It's complicated. It's very complicated. I don't quite understand the question, but I hope that answered the question. But they're different leaders. They preside over the same area. Putin is not a Marxist, but he's very educated about Marxism. As somebody who was, if you look at his history, he was very educated about Marxism. You should listen to some of what Putin has said about Lenin, right? Some of the speeches that he's given about Lenin and Lenin's influence, some of the problems of Lenin, but also some of the strengths of Lenin. It's fascinating. That's the thing about Putin, is that Putin is, I was in the same room with him, at the Uvalde Discussion Club and at the World Festival of Youth and Students, and that, he's a different kind of leader. Donald Trump, George W. Bush, it's like we like them because they're stupid, right? That's their appeal. That's the appeal of Donald Trump, of George W. Bush. It's like they're likable, stupid guys who know how to work a crowd and make us feel good about them. Putin is a very, very academic kind of leader, right? His entire presidency it was based on an economic theory that he wrote in his doctoral dissertation about how to save Russia's economy. And Putin, he draws from economic theory. He has a deep understanding of geopolitics, and that he's a very educated man, and he's the man who's assigned the task of running Russia. And it's a very different, the way he's viewed is very different than the way we view leaders in the United States. People don't want Putin to be their best friend. People don't want Putin to be someone that they go to the bar and drink with. They kind of want him to be the leader, if that makes sense. That's how I perceive it as a Westerner. I'm not a Russian. I've been to Russia a few times. I've been in the same room as Vladimir Putin. But, I'm just telling you how I perceive it through Western eyes, is that their attitude toward what a president should be is different than our attitude, right? We voted for George W. Bush in the United States because he seemed like a fun guy who we could all have a beer with. There's a feeling in Russia that that's not why a president should be selected. That a president, it's kind of like the president's almost like the CEO of a corporation, right? The president has a responsibility to do a job. He may not be your best friend, but he should know the job and get it done. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I saw it. Again, I'm just telling you from my own eyes. That's kind of how I saw it. And that's kind of like the way I feel like the Russians I spoke to saw him. They didn't see him as their best friend. They didn't see him as somebody who they wanted to have a beer with, or, and they weren't interested in TMZ stuff, right? They weren't interested in who his girlfriend was or who he's dating or, what someone tweeted about him today. They were more interested in, what does he have to say as a very highly educated person, a person with a lot of government experience, and towards making the country better, right? You can almost see Putin as kind of like the CEO of Russia, right? His job is to keep Russia strong and keep the economy going well, keep the society stable. That's his job. He does it well, right? Whereas George W. Bush, Obama even a little bit, right? Everyone was all, it's different, right? It's different. I'm telling you, again, I'm not Russian. So I can't comment. I can't get inside everyone's mind. I'm just telling you it's a little bit of a different approach, and that's kind of how I see it. One thing I remember about the World Festival of Youth and Students, was towards the end of the festival, I remember seeing Putin, all the kind of winning projects, right? Different young people from around the world had done different projects around the issue of aviation, around the issue of railway, around the issue of electricity, and they got up and presented kind of their science projects basically to the president of Russia. And what I thought was interesting is afterwards he got up and kind of critiqued them all a little bit. And he was just clear about what he thought. Well, I liked this idea about energy, didn't so much like this about aviation, and he gave an honest opinion of what he thought of these young people's science projects. And I thought that there was a level of honesty that, in the United States, imagine that Barack Obama, was presiding over a big science fair, right? And high achieving kids get up, Obama would just be like, oh, children are amazing, kids are the future. But Putin actually engaged with these young people, right? These are high school, college-aged young people presenting their academic work. And Putin actually said, well, this part I like, this part I don't like. And he gave his honest assessment. And everyone in the room was very curious about what the president of Russia had to say about these kids' science projects, for goodness sakes. I thought that was fascinating. It was not, if there, I mean, compare that to Trump or Obama or Bush, meeting with some, I mean, it's a totally different atmosphere. And again, that kind of points to what I was saying before, which is I get the impression that they see him differently than we see our leaders. There's just kind of a different approach to leadership and the role that a leader should play, right? Our leaders here, there's definitely a huge amount of love. There's a huge amount of love for Putin in Russia, a huge amount of love for him. But that love is different. They love different things about him. They don't love his personality necessarily. They love what he's done for the country. They love that he's a very educated person. They love that he knows what he's talking about, right? They're not like fawning over his tweets. Does that make sense? I hope I'm expressing this. It's kind of hard to put this into words, but that's basically what I observed. Very educated man who knew what he was doing. Has feminism moved away from the teachings of Rosa Luxemburg and Kallantai? Is today's feminism bourgeois feminism? Look, I don't want to mansplain. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to critique feminism. I'm not here to, it's interesting because I remember there's some like Trotskyist Marxist groups who will say things like feminism or Marxism, right? And they will say you can be a feminist, that's one school of thought, or you can be a Marxist. And there are some groups that will say, well, there's bourgeois feminism and there's proletarian feminism. There's different ways of understanding this. I know Kallantai, and she was, the Bolshevik feminist theorist. She actually clashed with Lenin a little bit. Lenin didn't agree with her, right? Her attitude towards sexuality, a lot of, what happened under Stalin was that Stalin very much eroded a lot of that stuff. They felt it was unstable, and that the Russian population, you have to remember, a lot of the population of Russia was deeply, deeply conservative, right? And that a lot of what Kallantai was advocating was not what they wanted. So it's complicated, but I think a lot of the voices that are advocating women's rights today advocated in a very, very different way than Kallantai and Luxemburg did. That said, though, let's not forget that, during the 1930s, the way the Communist International advocated women's rights was very different than Rosa Luxemburg and Kallantai also, right? And that there was, there's a whole thing about Stalin was promoting what he called the Soviet family, a mother and a father and kids, and both the mother and the father are working. The woman can go to college, the woman can work in a factory, the man can work in a factory, daycare. It was different. It was certainly not the traditional structure where the woman stayed at home and the man did all the work. But, it was not quote unquote feminism either, right? And that a lot of ideas that are associated with feminism nowadays, but even in Luxemburg and Kallantai's day, gender deconstruction, free love, a lot of the Bolshevik and Marxist governments around the world are not into that stuff. So it's complicated. I don't want to give a complete answer, and I'm a man, so I'm not going to explain feminism here. I'm not going to it's complicated. What does it mean to be a feminist? That's a good question. I've met people that are, call themselves conservative feminists, traditionalist feminists. I've met people that call themselves, socialist feminists, Marxist feminists. I've met people that say I could never be a Marxist because I'm a feminist. I've met people that say that, the greatest. I had a college professor who said that the most sexist government in all history was Mao's China, and insisted that no feminist could ever believe in Maoism and communism. Now, I don't agree with that, but so it's not that simple. It's funny. I recall that there's some kind of, I think she wrote for feministing.org, one of the main websites. She said that anyone who believes in the equality of the sexes is a feminist. So, and she had an essay you're a hardcore feminist, I swear, basically saying that anyone who believes in the equality of sexes is a feminist. Well, I believe in the equality of sexes. Right? I don't believe that males are superior to females. I don't believe that there's some kind of, inherent supremacy of the male gender over the female gender. So I guess that makes me a feminist, right? I believe that human beings are equal and should have equal rights. So based on that, I'm a feminist, according to her. However, right, according to some people, I am definitely not a feminist because I don't agree with U.S. foreign policy, or it's really complicated, okay? I'm just telling you, right? And some people will insist that, to be a feminist, you must absolutely hate all Muslims, right? Some people will insist. I'm not playing that game, and I don't generally talk about gender issues. Let's be real, okay? I don't go there, and I'll tell you why I don't go there. I don't go there because there's no way I can talk about them without offending somebody. I'm sure I offended 16 people just talking right now. I'm a man, but even if I wasn't a man, if I was female, it's very hard to talk about gender issues without offending a huge number of people. And I have seen so many leftist groups fall apart over these kinds of things. The transgender issue, the sex worker issue. There are different opinions among people that call themselves leftists and feminists. Let's be real about it, right? And, I am not here to go around telling people they're wrong or right on that. And that's, I know people, I have good friends that take one position on both of those issues, and I have good friends that take another position. And I have friends that mix and match, that maybe agree on one issue and disagree on another. That's okay. You know what I mean? If somebody, I could work with somebody who was, I have people that I know who believe in socialism but are deeply socially conservative, right? A lot of the Muslims I know, very strongly opposed to abortion, feel that abortion should be illegal. Now, I don't feel abortion should be illegal. I don't, right? I feel that because it's ambiguous, because it's not clear that fetus necessarily represents a life, right? That's kind of a spiritual, philosophical question. The government shouldn't regulate it, right? If we had a religious government, that might be different. We don't, right? And so, because of that, I feel like abortion should be legal, right? Because there's ambiguity. And also, talking about back alley, I feel abortion should be legal. I know people that are just as socialist as I am, just as revolutionary as I am, but because of their deep, Christian or deep Muslim beliefs, they don't agree with me. And I don't agree with them. And I have my position and they have theirs. And I would like to be able to work with people who maybe disagree with me on one or two issues. That doesn't mean that, it's complicated, right? And that I feel like I have seen leftist groups just fall apart over the transgender question, right? And just, at each other's throats, hate, violence. That's just not what I want to do. Same over the sex worker stuff. I just, I tend to avoid stuff like that. What do I think of the Red Army faction? Well, they were an ultra-left adventurous terrorist group in Germany. I don't know. They, Bader Meinhof, right? They were ultra-lefts. I think a lot of German young people that were anti-war protesters admired them. And that showed that there was kind of an anti-imperialist atmosphere in West Germany at that time, and that West Germany was drastically changing. But their tactics, I don't condone that kind of thing. I don't believe in left adventurism. I don't believe in terrorism. I think that political change comes through mobilizing the broad masses of people and the communists always favor a peaceful democratic transition to socialism. We don't like violence. We don't like terrorism. We don't like those kinds of things. We oppose that kind of thing. Right? And that genuine revolutionaries, going back to Marx, going even further than that, have always opposed ultra-left terrorist violence, right? And that's one thing that the enemies of Marxism are constantly accusing Marxists of being, constantly saying that Marxists believe in violence and terror. That's not the case, right? We want to come to power peacefully within the existing democratic and legal structures. And we hope that within the way capitalism is set up, that we would be able to peacefully organize, get socialists elected, enact socialist legislation, maybe change the U.S. Constitution to allow for more socialism, but we would prefer a peaceful democratic transition to socialism. However, we are also realistic in understanding that the capitalist ruling class of the United States, is very violent and repressive, and that many times around the world, we've seen democratic rights get trampled in order to preserve the property of the capitalists. Abraham Lincoln didn't even want to abolish slavery, but the ruling class of the South, the plantation-owning aristocracy capitalists, right, violently tried to overthrow the government, and in response to, Abraham Lincoln restricting slavery, right? So Lincoln was forced to engage in violence. There was a violent civil war in order to uphold legal authority, right? Lincoln was a revolutionary. Abraham Lincoln was a violent revolutionary. There's a violent revolutionary on your $5 bill and on your penny. But why was Lincoln a violent revolutionary? Did he want violence? Did he say, vote for me and I'm going to invade the South and burn everything down? Woo! No, he didn't. No, Lincoln said he didn't even want to abolish slavery, right? But he got into a situation where legally, the legal system, democracy, and the democratic procedures were being overturned, and he was forced to use violence in order to enforce the will of the people, which was the abolition of slavery. So Lincoln was a violent revolutionary, but Lincoln did not want to be a violent revolutionary, right? So that's what needs to be understood. And that, Bader Meinhof, Red Army faction, Weatherman, I don't endorse any of that stuff. I don't, right? I want a peaceful transition to socialism. I want people to peacefully organize. But I recognize that there are times around the world where people have been unable to do that, right? And that revolutions in themselves, when actual revolutions happen, the things that we understand to be violent revolutions are acts of self-defense. The Civil War was a violent revolution, but it was an act of self-defense, right? The U.S. government had to defend itself from the terrorism and violence of the slaveholders. In Russia, the Soviets had emerged, and Kornilov was going to violently destroy the Soviets. And so the Soviets formed an army to defend themselves, right? And eventually that led to the creation of the Soviet Union. In China, Mao wanted to participate in the elections and have a coalition government, with KMT and Chiang Kai-shek. And they were violent and suppressed him. In southern Korea, the communists wanted to have a coalition government. They wanted the North, they wanted the entire Korean peninsula to be part of one government. And the United States and Syngman Rhee massacred people at Jeju Island, and Korea ended up having a violent war because the road of peaceful transition was cut off. That's the difference, right? Salvador Allende got elected in Chile peacefully with the support of the Communist Party, with the support of the movement of the Revolutionary Left, with the support of the Radical Socialist Party. And he was violently overthrown in a coup, right? The capitalists believe in violence. The capitalists believe in terrorism. They're committing terrorism and left adventurous violence not left adventurous, or adventurous violence in Venezuela, trying to overthrow the government, right? They're committing terrorism and violence all over the world, against China, against Iran, against Russia, against any country that breaks out of their system. However, those who are scientific, those who are actual Marxists, what they advocate is the opposite. They want stability. They want to work within the existing structures to have a peaceful and democratic transition to socialism. However, the capitalists of the Western world are known to use violence. And when people are facing violence, not in non-political situations, you're walking down the street, if someone tries to beat you up, you're going to fight back. That's what humans do, right? And so when faced with violence and terror, people do tend to defend themselves. And that's how revolutions happen. That's what revolutions are. Revolutions are acts of self-defense, right? And that no revolution in all of history ever has happened because somebody went out and did what Red Army faction or the Weathermen did. Never. In fact, when people do that, that tends to reinforce the status quo. That tends to make the status quo even stronger because people are terrified of revolutionaries because they seem like violent, scary people. So, no, I don't. That's that. And that when violent revolutions happen, it's not because socialists and Marxists want it. It's because socialists and Marxists have done everything they can to try to avoid it. It's because people's lives are on the line. People are being killed and being murdered and being terrorized. And in response to that, have to defend themselves. Let's be very clear about that. Let's be very, very clear about that, right? And every revolution in history, go through the history of the United States, go through the history of Latin America, go through the history of Russia, of China. Violent revolutions don't happen because of left adventurism. They happen when there is no other choice, when millions of people are forced to defend themselves. That's when it happens. That's when violent revolutions happen. That's how it's always happened. That's science, right? That left adventurism has never worked, and it has the opposite effect. So there you go. Folks. I know some of you are just joining us now. So if you're just joining us now, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and please tweet this out. Please make this a bigger conversation. I'm having a great time. We're talking about communism. We're talking about politics. We're talking about all kinds of stuff. I got plenty more to talk about, so do you. Like I said before, I love super chats. So if you want to shoot a super chat my way, that would be great. I'll be sure to talk about what you talk about. Nepal. All right, there was a request, multiple requests that I talk about Nepal. All right, so it's funny. It's very funny for me. So when I was like high school age and getting into Marxism, I was interested in Mao. And one of the places that everyone who was a Maoist on the internet and Maoist groups talked about is Nepal. They said, oh, in Nepal, there's a glorious people's war going on. And the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, is carving out liberated territory in the countryside. And the monarchy, the king, has taken power, as a dictator. And it's, the Nepal, it's a revolution and all that. And, it sounded good to me, right? And I didn't believe in an absolute monarchy. And I thought that the communists in Nepal fighting, for their national democratic revolution that they called it, and I thought that was pretty exciting. But then I remember I was a college student, and at that point, the king stepped down, and the seven-party alliance took power. And the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, was part of the seven-party alliance. And I rejoiced. And I said, this is great, right? The monarch, the absolute monarch backed by the United States, has been toppled. The seven-party alliance has come to power, which includes not just the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, but also the Workers and Peasants Party and the United Marxist-Leninist Party. And I was very excited. I thought this is a great moment. And I saw that Prachanda, the leader of the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, said, our revolution is won. I thought it was amazing. And these Maoists I was hanging out with said, oh, they sold out. And I was like, wait, what? For the longest time, I was excited about Hugo Chavez, these Maoists I was hanging out with. Oh, Hugo Chavez isn't a real communist. I was excited about Cuba. Cuba is not a real communist. The real communists are in Nepal. Then the communists in Nepal took power, and they're like, oh, they're a bunch of phonies. You're a phony. And I was just like, oh, God. Really? So the one group I'm allowed to support, if I'm going to be a pure Maoist like you, seizes power, and now I'm not allowed to support him anymore? What? What? And that's when I did this double take, and I was like, what? Huh? What? I was just at the point where I was just like, what's going on here? That made me start to wonder, and at that point I was just kind of like, okay, Now, what's interesting, I will say about Nepal, is since then, right? So now, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, it's now it's actually merged, right? So now a lot of the Communist parties of Nepal merged into one. And the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, was when they were waging their rural people's war, they took like what you might call ultra-Maoist positions, right? They didn't support Deng Xiaoping, they didn't support modern China, they thought modern China were traitors. But now that they're in power, they've changed their position. And if you read about it, the Communist Party of Nepal, the unified Communist Party of Nepal, is very excited about President Xi Jinping. They're very excited about the Belt and Road Initiative. They've overseen a huge amount of foreign investment from China. China has built all kinds of infrastructure there, and they take inspiration from China. And now the Communist Party of Nepal and the Nepali communists are very pro-China, and they have written some beautiful statements about how they aim for socialist development of Nepal. You should read some of their stuff. It's very exciting. And I feel like, in a way, Nepal's politics shifted. The communists of Nepal changed their politics, and so did mine, right? When they were, now they're running the country. And they're friendly to China, and they're studying Xi Jinping. And, I've written articles in the past for China.org, the website. And actually, China.org runs some of the best articles on Nepal about what's happening there. They have writers in Nepal that write on the political developments. Very exciting stuff. Very good stuff, right? The communists of Nepal have evolved and shifted as global situations have changed. I think that's very exciting. The situation in Nepal is very fluid. That's all there is to it. And that things have changed, right? And that it's very exciting. And what I think is interesting is that in Nepal, so the group that was waging the rural campaign, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, was at one point part of something called the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, which was like connected to like the RCP of the United States. Then there was this other party in Nepal called the Communist Party United Marxist-Leninists, and they were like basically tied to the CPUSA of the United States. Then there was this other party in Nepal called the Worker and Peasant Party of Nepal, And they were tied in with the Socialist Unity Center of India and the Bangladesh Socialist Party, and that's like another trend. And I think they're all in the same party now, right? I think there's one Communist Party of Nepal, but it's not, you can have your different beliefs, right? There are some people in it that are more like the RCP. There are some people in it that are more like CPUSA. There's some people in it that are more like, different trends, and that they have formed one unified Communist Party, the Unified Communist Party of Nepal, but it has, different beliefs in it, right? And it's similar to what they have in Venezuela, the United Socialist Party. Very similar. I think that's exciting. Nepal is definitely worth studying and worth following. Yeah, I'm for it. So I hope that answers your question. Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to spread the word, right? Make this a bigger conversation. And don't feed the trolls, right? I see a bunch of trolls in the chat, and whatever, right? Don't feed the trolls. Don't feed the trolls, as they say. I see a lot of questions about Trotskyism, so I wanted to answer that. Trotskyism, folks. Trotskyism. So, what is Trotskyism? First of all, what is it, right? Because, right? So, Trotsky was an individual figure who was key in the Russian Revolution, very well-known Russian Marxist. But what is Trotskyism? Right? So, right? In Russia, there was a Marxist movement. Right? The Marxist movement in Russia was founded by Yuri Plekhanov. Plekhanov is the guy who brought Marx's writings to Russia. And Yuri Plekhanov formed something called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And it was different than the Kropotkin anarchists and the Socialist Revolutionary Party because they organized the peasantry, whereas the Marxists organized factory workers. It was different than the terrorists and the anarchists because they engaged in violence, whereas basically the Bolshevik, basically the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Marxist Party of Russia, believed in organizing labor unions. That's what they were about. They organized factory workers to go on strike, demand higher wages and better conditions. That's what they were. That was the Labor Party, or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. So then, in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, you have Lenin, or Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin comes along, and he says we need to organize a different kind of party. He says we need to be different than the parties in Western Europe. We need to form the party of a new type. The party of a new type, which is, a vanguard party that follows his theory. We need a party only reserved for those who give the whole of their lives, a party that is ahead of the masses and constantly pushing them forward, building a bigger confrontation. He criticizes the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party because they bow to spontaneity. Whenever the working class in Russia does something, they run behind them and say good job and bow to spontaneity. Lenin's saying that the vanguard party should do the opposite. It should be ahead of the workers, constantly pushing them to do more, right? What is to be done is the name of Lenin's pamphlet calling for the creation of a vanguard party. So he pitches his idea to a vanguard party, and he goes around to all the big Russian Marxists and says, hey, I'm forming a vanguard party. And then Bukharin, Zinoviev, Stalin, all these people, he's pitching it to them. Trotsky is one of the people, right? And they have a meeting in exile in London at the founding conference of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and the majority of the people in the room join the vanguard party that Lenin forms. So that vanguard party is called the Bolsheviks, or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Bolshevik. Whereas the majority or the minority of the people in the room don't go with it, and so they stay and they keep the party of the old type, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they're the minority, so they're the Mensheviks, right? Trotsky was a Menshevik. He was just like Lenin. He was in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin called for the formation of a new vanguard party. Trotsky didn't agree with it. Trotsky, however, he didn't agree with the Mensheviks either. He thought they were not radical enough. So Trotsky tried to form something called the August Bloc. And it was this idea that he was going to get the Bolsheviks and the most radical people in the Mensheviks to form this thing called the August Bloc. It didn't work. It failed. And so it was kind of a flop. Well, the August Bloc failed. So after the August Bloc, Trotsky maintained his own following. He just had a group of people, and people just called him the Trotskyists. And they liked Trotsky. They read what Trotsky wrote. They listened to Trotsky's speeches. Trotsky was in Europe. He was in Switzerland and Sweden, but he was writing all kinds of pamphlets about overthrowing the Tsar and Marxism and stuff like that. He was very close to a guy named Parvus. And basically, Trotsky developed what he called the theory of permanent revolution. The theory of permanent revolution, which amazingly, no Trotskyist can talk to you about. It's beyond me, right? But it's like the central thesis of Trotsky's life is this thing called the theory of permanent revolution. The theory of permanent revolution. And the theory of permanent revolution is that in order to have socialism, only the working class, only factory workers can create socialism. So, if you're in a country that is not majority worker, if you're in a country that is led by peasants, a working class party must seize power, and that working class party must make the country only a temporary holdout in the struggle to seize Western Europe, where factory workers are the majority. Right? That's the theory of permanent revolution. Russia could not have a socialist revolution because it was a peasant country. Now, Lenin, when writing the position of the Bolshevik Party, says he calls for a worker and a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. That's the name of the government that the Bolsheviks are for. Trotsky doesn't agree. No, because the peasantry, according to Trotsky, is an inherently reactionary class. It is a class without a future. The peasant is reactionary, and the peasant is hopeless. The peasant seeks to become a capitalist, right? He wants his own land so he can become a capitalist. Peasants are this disgusting class without a future. He hates peasants. So he's for only a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers, right? No peasantry, none. That's Trotsky's big thesis. And Lenin doesn't agree with it. And there's harsh, heated words between Trotsky and Lenin. They curse each other. They speak of each other in really nasty terms, right? And Lenin denounces the theory of permanent revolution. He says, no, in countries like Russia and countries like China, you can have a socialist revolution. It'll be led by the working class party in alliance with the peasantry. Trotsky says, oh, no, can't do that. Meanwhile, Lenin writes a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, he basically says, look, in the West, in the Western countries, the working class is being divided. You have really high-paid workers who hate really low-paid workers and love the bosses. You have really high-paid workers who think that imperialism around the world is a good thing. So revolutions are not going to be happening in the West anytime soon. The revolutions are going to happen in the developing countries. They're going to happen in countries that are less developed, countries like Russia, countries like China, countries like South America. That's where socialism is going to happen, because in the Western countries, and World War I is considered the proof of that. When World War I breaks out and all these socialist parties all over Europe support it, Lenin says, see, I told you, these socialists and the working class of the Western countries doesn't have revolutionary energy. The revolutionary energy is in the developing countries. And, Lenin says, nationalism is something that the communists in the developing countries should support, right? If you're in Mexico being a colonized, impoverished country, instead of just calling for socialism in Mexico, you should call for make Mexico great again, fight for the Mexican people against the empire, Mexico first, right? You can be a nationalist, right? I have not watched The Wandering Earth. I don't know what that is. It's basically saying that on the basis of national liberation, communists will come to power in the developing countries, and they will lead alliances with other classes, like peasants, like capitalists even, right? That communists will be at the center of national liberation-based revolutions. That's what Lenin's arguing. Trotsky is saying, oh, no. The Western country is where it's at because there's factory workers there. He says New York City, where he lived for a long time, New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged, right? New York City is the hope of the world. London is the hope of the world. Paris is the hope of the world. This is where the real energy is. And Russia and all these countries in the third world, a bunch of backward countries, they don't have enough workers there, so they can't have socialist revolutions. That's the theory of permanent revolution. And permanent revolution and Parvus, a guy named Parvus, Trotsky have their theory, right? Trotsky has his theory. That's the difference. July of 1917, right? So until February of 1917, Trotsky is living in New York City. Right? He's living here and he's writing articles and stuff. And, he has a Russian language communist newspaper called Novy Mir. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it means new peace. And it's this daily, communist newspaper to Russians living in New York City. He lives on the Lower East Side, I believe. He has an apartment and he's unpopular because he doesn't tip in restaurants because he thinks tipping is humiliation. So he always lectures the waiters about, I'm not giving you a tip because you should organize a union and be revolutionary. And, he's hated. He's like, waiters are like spilling coffee on him and he's hated. And Trotsky's living there and he's getting money from people around the world that support him. And, he's sitting there and he's this intellectual. Well, the February Revolution happens. The Tsar is overthrown. Russia is in a state of revolution. So Trotsky, and he's not the only Russian radical. A lot of Russian radicals are living in New York City because New York City is a place to go if you're in exile. Still to this day, there's a lot of people in New York City, like that. What's her name? Anyway. So a lot of people are, so a lot of them go home. Bukharin, right? He goes home, right? They all go home. And keep in mind, in the 1905 revolution, which happened 12 years before the Russian Revolution, Trotsky had been elected president of the St. Petersburg Soviet. So he had this big reputation as this guy who was like a really well-known revolutionary figure. And he was really well-known in the United States. He could speak English fluently. So he would give speeches about Russia, and he was really well-known in socialist circles in the United States. In fact, when the Russian Revolution happens, that's another story. So anyway, Trotsky, he's well-known and all that. He goes back and, the Tsar has been overthrown. The provisional government has been set up in Russia. And the provisional government is, it's continuing to fight World War I, but it's trying to have a constituent assembly and write a quote-unquote democratic constitution. And the Bolsheviks are the anti-war party, right? They're the party that is opposed to the war, right? And there's a lot of people in World War I who just don't want to continue fighting it, right? A lot of Russians think World War I is not good. They think they're fighting for the British, they're fighting for the French, they're not fighting. It's in their national interest to do business with the Germans. There's a lot of capitalists in Russia who feel that way too. A lot of factory owners and capitalists in Russia are like, hey, why are we fighting a war with Germany? Maybe we should do business with Germany. Other capitalists, however, who are doing business with the United States and France feel differently. So there's a divide in the bourgeoisie. So then, throughout what they call the July days, there's all these strikes and uprisings led by the Bolsheviks against the war, right? And the Bolsheviks are known to everybody as the anti-war guys. They are against the war. And Trotsky sees that the Bolsheviks have real energy. They have a big organization behind them. They have a daily newspaper called Pravda that comes out every day. They're organizing armed strikes and taking over buildings, and they're doing stuff. So Trotsky joins the Bolsheviks in July of 1917. Right? So Trotsky joins the Bolshevik Party. And then, as we know, September, you have the Kornilov reaction. General Kornilov is going to come in and install himself as the military dictator and execute all the people that oppose the war. So, of course, the Bolsheviks, form a militia and all this stuff and basically drive off Kornilov's reaction. And then they establish the Soviet government in October. They seize the telegraph offices and they announce that the Soviets, these workers' councils that they formed, are the new government. And Trotsky's part of the Russian Revolution. He joins in July, right? And he's a figure in the Russian Revolution. So after the revolution, right, you have the Russian Civil War. And during the Russian Civil War, Trotsky, because he's a good speaker, Trotsky's a very good speaker and writer, he becomes the propagandist of the Red Army. And they give him a costume, right? He wears this big long coat and leather pants and this this army hat. And he's wearing this it's kind of funny now, but back then that was like a really cool military outfit, and he's dressed in leather pants and big long leather coats, and he's on a train and he's going from town to town, from army base to army base, going, the workers will rise up, and giving fiery speeches and, stirring people up. And when he shows up, right, they have all the deserters lined up at the military base and they're going to shoot them and give them the death penalty. But then Trotsky's train arrives just before they're about to shoot him, and he says, I saved you, and he saves them, right? That's what Trotsky was famous for, is that he would stop the executions and save their lives and forgive them for being traitors and give a big speech, and everyone would be fired up. And he was the main he was the main propagandist of the Red Army. In Trotsky's writings, he makes it sound like he was the main, military strategist, or he was the main military leader, and that's malarkey. That's BS, right? He wasn't that. He was the main, performer. He was a good speaker, very good writer, right? He could stir people up and all that, and he had a job to do, and he did it pretty well, right? I mean, and they needed somebody who could be the fiery, exciting orator, and he did all kinds of stuff, right? Like, I mean, some of it even sounds a little bit corny, like Donald Trump a little bit, right? Like he, when he showed up, he had gold watches. And he would give some random soldier a gold watch. Like, Trotsky showed up and you just won a gold watch. Yay! I mean, it sounds a little corny to me, but it worked, right? And he would stop the execution of the deserters, and he would give the fiery speech, and he was the propagandist of the Red Army, right? And it worked, right? It worked, right? And, Lenin was doing the military strategy. Stalin was doing the military strategy. But Trotsky was the front man. He was the whatever. I mean, and he was good at it, right? And he did it very well. Keep in mind, though, the Russian Civil War was a horrendous war. Millions of people died. And Russia was blockaded during that time, right? They couldn't get medical care. Like, people were dying. It was a pretty awful time. Pretty hard time. We have no idea. We really have no effing idea how bad things were during the Russian Civil War. None whatsoever. You want to talk about bad times. I mean, there's a blockade, you can't get medicine, people are starving to death, people are dying. There's 2 armies ravaging the country, 15 different countries invade, Britain invades, the USA sends soldiers, Germany invades. I mean, in this bad time, Trotsky is the orator who holds the Russian Revolution together. He's the face of the Red Army, okay? That's what he did. That's a good thing to do, right? He did a good job of it, apparently. According to all the reports, he was a very good speaker and writer and whatever, right? I mean, and in those circumstances, I mean, pretty unbelievable. So, right, Trotsky, after the Russian Civil War is over, there's a question now. They were all hoping there would be a revolution in Germany. There wasn't. Right? There were some uprisings in Germany. There were some uprisings in Yugoslavia and Hungary, places like that. But there wasn't going to be a revolution. So what does the Soviet Union do next is the big debate. And there are 3, Lenin dies, and there are 3 factions in the Bolshevik Party. And there's not supposed to be any factions, mind you. Lenin called for a ban on factions, but there's 3 opinions. The first opinion is the opinion of thank you for the super chat, I do appreciate it, is the opinion of Bukharin, right? And Bukharin says, look, he says, we're an impoverished country. We're an impoverished country. We need to sign peace treaties with the West and bring in foreign investment and just continue capitalism until we're a more prosperous country, basically. We're too poor to really have socialism. That's basically Bukharin's argument, right? And so we should sign peace treaties with the West and just kind of, bring in foreign investment, and then maybe we'll get wealthy enough to have socialism. And you have Stalin's position. Stalin says we need socialism in one country. He says we need to sign treaties with the West. We need to stop spreading revolution throughout the Western world. But at the same time, we're going to nationalize the industries. We're going to have 5-year economic plans and build up our own economy. That's Stalin's position. Trotsky's position is permanent revolution. Trotsky says, well, no, we should draft every adult male in Russia into the army. We should make all the factories to be run by the army, and we should make Russia into a giant military base to spread communism throughout Europe, because again, his theory of permanent revolution is all that matters is the West, right? We can't have socialism in Russia. It's too poor, too many peasants, so we should basically forcibly draft everyone into the army and prepare for an all-out war with the West, right? So first, Stalin and Bukharin teamed up and defeated Trotsky. Trotsky lost. Oddly, Khrushchev was kind of a supporter of him for a while, but that's a whole other story. Then Stalin and Bukharin had their falling out. And ultimately, Stalin won out. And the Soviet Union began building socialism in one country. And when it did that, it was admired by people all over the world. Their economic achievements, it was like people couldn't believe what they were doing. The rest of the world was having the Great Depression, right? The Great Depression hit in 1929. 1928, Russia had already started the 5-year plans, and people were blown away. They electrified the whole country. They built huge steel mills. They built the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the world, the Dnepr Dam in Ukraine. They did all this amazing stuff, and the whole world was blown away. Socialism in one country did a pretty darn good job, right? However, Trotsky lost. He lost, right? He lost the vote, and so he forms like an underground faction, and they're like passing out leaflets and urging the overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy and all of that. So basically, Trotsky's ejected from the country. He's exiled. They send him to Turkey first, where he, and then eventually he goes to France, and then he goes to Mexico. And in exile, Trotsky claims that he still supports the Soviet Union, but he says that the Soviet Union is bureaucratized. It's a degenerated workers' state, right? That it's the foundations of the socialist system exist in Russia, but the leadership is counter-revolutionary, right? That there's a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy that has taken power. And basically, what Trotsky does from the time of his exile in 1928 until his death in 1940 is he's a professional anti-communist. And he starts going all over the world, giving speeches denouncing the Soviet Union, right? He wrote articles for the New York Tribune, the New York Journal American by William Randolph Hearst. And whatever the Soviet Union did was wrong, and he would get paid by social democrats and anti-communists to get up and go all over the world giving anti-communist speeches. And he got paid, and he was a I don't know what you want to call him. He was almost like a circus act. I hate to say it, but it was kind of like, back then there wasn't any TV. It was like, get your tickets today. Come see a real live Russian communist. And people, he was somebody who had led the Russian Revolution. So he was, everywhere he went, people would pile into his speeches and listen to him because he was it was like, here is a real live Russian communist leader, Leon Trotsky. That's kind of what he did. That's who he was. He was the, this is Trotsky. He was a circus act. He was, that's what he was. What more is there to it, right? He was, and he hated the Soviet government. And that was his thing, right? He was somebody who was part of the Russian Revolution. He was somebody who'd been with Lenin, but he could talk smack against Stalin. So he had a role to play, I guess, for social democrats, for Western capitalism, and he had a following, and his followers were kicked out of communist parties. They formed, and what's hilarious is Trotsky was still alive, right? He didn't die until 1940, but he forms, in the USA, they form the Communist League, it's called, led by James Cannon. That's like the Trotskyist group. And immediately there's a split. A guy named B.J. Fields forms the Revolutionary League of Struggle, and Trotskyism splits. And Trotsky, of course, favors James Cannon. There's, Hugo Euler, right? And that immediately, and that you read James Cannon, who's like the father of American Trotskyism. They talk about how they had this big problem because the Communist Party in the United States was huge. And anybody who had any disagreement with the Communist Party immediately joined the Trotskyists, right? So all kinds of people that just, I don't know what their issue was. They were just not agreeable people. They didn't like how disciplined the Communist Party was. And the Communist Party USA, in the 30s, they did amazing things, but they were also a little bit cultish, right? They were it was a very rigid and authoritarian way that they were set up, right? They would have conventions and every vote was like 100%, right? You didn't vote wrong, stuff like that, right? So the Communist Party did amazing stuff, hunger marches, unemployment, building the labor unions, but it was very kind of rigid and top down, right? And so you'd get these kind of intellectuals and free thinkers that would join the Communist Party and they'd be frustrated. They wouldn't agree with something. So they'd all become Trotskyists. And so Trotskyism became a collection of misfits, basically. People who didn't fit in the Communist Party became Trotskyists. And the Trotskyists realized that this is a problem. It's funny. You read The History of American Trotskyism by James Cannon, and he has a hilarious thing about how, a guy, tried to join the Trotskyists, and they wouldn't let him join because he had a long beard, and he wore a green felt suit. And it's it became like a collection of weirdos and people who just couldn't fit in the Communist Party ended up joining the Trotskyists, right? And that was basically in the United States, and this is the hilarious thing, Right, nowadays, there's like a million communist parties. In the USA in the 30s, in the 1930s, there were 4, maybe 3 communist parties, right? Or 3 left groups. You had the Socialist Party, you had the Trotskyists, and you had the Communist Party. That was it. And now there were a bunch of other little breakaway Trotskyist groups, but everyone just called them the Trotskyists, right? That was it, right? And for a while there was like the right opposition. There was the Lovestonites, but they basically merged with the Trotskyites, right? And it's just, it's basically Trotskyism became the other communists. If you were a communist who didn't like Stalin, you could be a Trotskyist. And Stalin, of course, being denounced as a dictator and a mass murderer in American media, a lot of kind of more liberal people that were more in line with Western society and didn't like the Soviet Union, of course, they became Trotskyists, for a while, the Trotskyists joined the Socialist Party. They were in the Socialist Party for a while. They merged. There was a left party called the American Workers' Party, and they joined the American Workers' Party, and then they emerged into the Socialist Party. Eventually, they formed the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939, right? And that was the main Trotskyist party. But even then, like right after they formed in 1939, right? 1939 is the year that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact. 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, right? And Trotsky basically said that the Soviet Union had the right to do that. Trotsky said he didn't agree with how they did it. He didn't agree with how it was carried out, right? Didn't agree with how it was carried out. But on the other hand, he said they had the right to do it. So based on that, right, a whole big faction of Trotskyists broke with Trotsky, right? Max Shachtman, who was a big Trotskyist in New York City, Martin Aburn, right, James Burnham. These are 3 big-name Trotskyists in New York City, the New York City faction of the SWP. Shachtman, Aburn, and Burnham quit the Socialist Workers' Party. And Trotsky wrote a whole book denouncing them. Called In Defense of Marxism. And James Cannon wrote a whole book explaining their split called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. And basically, a whole lot of the people that became neocons, neoconservatives, are people who left the SWP in 1939. So that's the neocon connection. That's when people talk about Trotskyite neocons. Well, they were people who stopped being Trotskyists. Max Shachtman, all right, he disagreed with Trotsky. He said that the 1939 pact with Nazi Germany was wrong, and that based on that, the Soviet Union was not a socialist country. That based on that, the Soviet Union was a bureaucratic collectivist state. The Soviet Union was state capitalism. We've heard all of this, right? And what is now the ISO, right? International Socialist Organization. I guess now they're a faction in DSA, but they were originally called the ISO. They were Shachtmanites. It was the Independent Socialist Clubs of Berkeley. They were the followers of Max Shachtman, right? Irving Kristol was a Shachtmanite, right? Who else was a Shachtmanite? Gene Kirkpatrick was a Shachtmanite. A lot of big neocons were in this circle. And if you read The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, if you read In Defense of Marxism, basically, Trotsky and the others realized that these people were not working class. These were middle class intellectuals, right? And that they disagreed with proletarian forms of organizing. That they were motivated by middle class alienation. That's why they were socialists. They were not interested in class struggle, right? They didn't believe in populism and workers against bosses. It was just about socialism will free the artists and the intellectuals. And so based on that, right, that's where you have the origins of what you could call Trotskyism, right? And the neocon link is that, the Shachtman group, Max Shachtman was he said there was nothing in the Soviet Union was working class. It was a counter-revolutionary government, whatever. Max Shachtman, right? He became a big labor union leader in the New York City. He eventually dropped Lenin and started opposing Leninism, right? And joined the Socialist Party. And at the time of his death, he died in the mid-60s, he supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. He thought the Bay of Pigs invasion against Cuba was good. And then he led a lot of people that they started calling the State Department Socialists. Michael Harrington, the guy who eventually founded DSA, were people that were technically socialists. And Ramiro points out the founder of the National Endowment for Democracy. They believed in socialism, but they were motivated purely by anti-communism, right? And that a lot of the people that are neoconservatives, a lot of those folks, their origins is with that group. And they were against the CP in the 30s. They were against Russia and the CPUSA in the 30s. They were against the Communist Party. They broke with Trotsky because Trotsky thought there was still something good about the Soviet Union. And they became their own thing, right? And they're this middle-class current that doesn't believe in populism, that's anti-populist, right? They don't believe in populism and workers and class struggle, and they don't believe in that, right? They think the masses are a big horde and that socialism is for the intellectuals, right? Irving Kristol, I quote it because it really tells you everything you need to know. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyist until he got drafted into the army. And he was drafted into the army. And he said he didn't believe in Marxism anymore because he said he thought that the working class people in the army with him were anti-Semitic. He thought they were stupid. He thought they were fools. And he didn't believe in workers' power anymore, right? And that a lot of them had been Trotskyists, where they didn't like the Soviet Union, they didn't like the communist parties, but they kind of believed in, socialism in this weird kind of middle-class way. And then they more and more. And then as the Cold War started, and then one big game changer was in 1948, Israel was created, right? And the Communist Party supported Israel. The Trotskyists oddly didn't support Israel, but as Israel became more and more siding with the United States in the Cold War, the Communist Party and the Soviet Union were against Israel, right? And that was from the beginning, right? I mean, mid-50s, already the Soviet Union and Israel are not getting along. 1967 war is when the Soviet Union officially starts supporting the Palestinians and starts opposing Israel. But a lot of these intellectuals, not only were they anti-Soviet, but they were very pro-Israel. When Israel was founded, they felt like Israel was a good thing, and they took that to another level. So they became neocons, right? The ones who remained Trotskyists. Trotskyists tend to be very anti-Israel, but the ones who went full neocon, like Gene Kirkpatrick, like Irving Kristol, were also, that was kind of the nail in the coffin. That was when they ultimately just kind of became full-on right-wingers, is when they ultimately supported Israel, right? Irving Kristol is considered the father of neoconservatism. Irving Kristol was a New York City working-class guy, went to college. In college, he joined the Trotskyists. He was a Trotskyist. And in the 50s, the CIA approached a prominent Trotskyist intellectual in New York City named Sidney Hook. Sidney Hook was a Trotskyite professor in New York City. He was like an academic, and he was a Trotskyite. And the CIA approached him in 1949 and had him run something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And Sidney Hook organized it, right? This big Trotskyist intellectual organized with the CIA. And he said he was going to create a wave of democracy so strong it would tear down the Soviet Union. And Sidney Hook arranged for one of his Trotskyist buddies, a working-class guy from Brooklyn who had worked his way up through academia to become one of the main organizers of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that guy was Irving Kristol. And Irving Kristol, the Congress for Cultural Freedom claimed to be left-wing and socialist. And so that's what he did as a CIA operative. This Trotskyist, Irving Kristol, worked for the CIA for a while. But his views started to change, right? And that he basically had already stopped being a Marxist, he says, during World War II. And in the 50s, he was still hanging around in left-wing circles, and Sidney Hook arranged for him to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But by the 60s, he was a conservative, and he was advising the Nixon campaign. Irving Kristol, right, went from Trotsky to neocon, right? Now, Ramiro mentions David Horowitz. David Horowitz is a very different case. So David Horowitz's parents were members of the Communist Party in New York City. David Horowitz, he got hired by something called Ramparts Magazine. And Ramparts Magazine was in San Francisco. And it was actually a Roman Catholic newspaper. And some people speculate there's some kind of CIA connection. Regardless, it became the main, new left, anti-Vietnam War, pro-civil rights newspaper in the Bay Area in the 60s, right? Ramparts Magazine. And David Horowitz, whose parents had been members of the Communist Party USA, David Horowitz became the editor of it. And he was against his parents. He thought the Communist Party was authoritarian, and he was he's a hippie, basically. A hippie. Parents are in the Communist Party USA, but that's a bunch of squares, and he's more radical than that dude, and he's cool. That's David Horowitz. David Horowitz was a hippie who edited Ramparts Magazine. And Ramparts magazine, promoted the Black Panthers. Eldridge Cleaver, no one would have ever heard of Eldridge Cleaver except he was in prison writing articles, and Ramparts magazine started publishing his writings. And some people speculate that there's theories that Ramparts was run by the CIA. I'm not going to get into that. It's a weird thing. It's a Roman Catholic magazine, but it ended up being the main magazine that was pro-civil rights movement and anti-Vietnam War, and it did a lot to support the Black Panthers in the Bay Area. There's conspiracy theories about it. I don't know exactly, but they were the main kind of new left. They always opposed the communist parties, always very critical of the socialist countries for not being revolutionary enough. But Ramparts magazine was the big leftist magazine in the Bay Area, and Bob Avakian actually worked for them. It's funny, that was like the first job that Bob Avakian ever had, is he worked for the Ramparts magazine. He talks about that in his autobiography. He worked at Ramparts, and so did Eldridge Cleaver. So did a lot of big people that were like big 1960s leftists in California. They worked for Ramparts magazine. And, Ramparts eventually went under. It went under. I mean, after the mid-70s, there was no movement anymore, right? And as the 1960s was over and all the protest stuff, Ramparts just they didn't have any advertising, they didn't have any readership, and they went under. They surrendered. They just went out of business. And so David Horowitz was out of a job. In the 80s, David Horowitz was suddenly a conservative. There you go. Now, one thing many people have pointed out is that his entire career, David Horowitz was always a strong supporter of Israel. David Horowitz has this whole thing about the Black Panthers killed his girlfriend. I mean, that's what he says. I don't know if that's true. And he's written he has this whole, autobiography with all this stuff about he hates the left and he knows how evil communists are. But he wasn't one of those like Trotskyite turned neocons. He's a new lefty. His parents were in the Communist Party USA, and he worked for Ramparts, and he was the editor of Ramparts, and he was like a new left, anti-communist but left-wing Black Panther supporting radical in the Bay Area. And I don't know. I honestly, when he was working for Ramparts, there's speculation that Ramparts was getting funding from somebody and that this was a Congress for Cultural Freedom operation. At that point, the CIA was funneling a lot of money to new left groups, right? Now, did Ramparts get CIA money? I don't know. I've never seen that documented. It's pretty weird. It's pretty damn weird that it went from being a Catholic, conservative magazine to being a new left publication. It's also interesting that they were always really, really anti-communist party and anti-Soviet. But, who knows? Back then, there were a lot of people who just opposed the Vietnam War. There were a lot of people who just opposed Jim Crow segregation and supported black freedom. So it's complicated, right? But yeah, Horowitz comes out of Ramparts magazine. That's David Horowitz. He was the Ramparts guy. Ramparts went belly up in the 70s. David Horowitz was kind of, who knows where he went. And in the 80s, all of a sudden, he was an expert on the evils of communism. And he was the big neoconservative, anti-communist during the Reagan years. And, let me add, and David Horowitz was always pro-Israel, right? Because to be a new leftist, there were a lot of people who marched against the Vietnam War who were super pro-Israel. A lot of people who marched for civil rights were super pro-Israel. Opposing Israel didn't really become big among Marxists and leftists until like the 80s and 90s, right? It's very weird, right? Until most of the communist and Marxist movement was pro-Israel, until at least 1967. Right, the Communist Party USA, even in the 1967 war, they still wrote, big long things about Israel has the right to exist. Martin Luther King was very pro-Israel, right? And it wasn't opposing Israel, right? I believe the first Palestinian speaker at a national anti-war rally was in 1980, right? Every anti-war rally, national anti-war rally, had banned Palestinian speakers because that was offensive to Jewish people, they said. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that Palestine became like a leftist cause, right? And that's interesting. But David Horowitz, from the beginning of, from the time he was a kid in the Communist Party with his parents, up until today, he's always been very consistently pro-Israel. He's very, very pro-Israel. And Israel has changed, right? In the 60s and 50s, Israel presented itself as a leftist cause. When Israel started, they presented themselves like they were going to be a big socialist commune in the desert. I kid you not, right? It's very interesting. You talk to older leftists, they talk about in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, it was Republicans who were against Israel, and it was Democrats and leftists that were more pro-Israel. Henry Wallace, who was the vice president, he led pro-Israel marches and protests against Harry Truman, saying Harry Truman wasn't pro-Israel enough, right? The Israel celebration in New York City in 1948 when Israel was created, it was communists who organized it, right? And that in its early years, in its early years, Israel presented itself as a left-wing country, right? The Haganah, the Israeli Labor Party, was the main party back then, and Israel, and they talk about hippies, right? Or not hippies, but like beatniks in the 50s used to walk up and down the streets of Manhattan selling trees. Buy a tree in Israel. Buy a tree in Israel. And that used to be a thing that leftists and hippies did. And Israel had the kibbutz movement, where they had these little military commune things that were kind of socialistic. And it wasn't really until like 1978 when you had the shift in Israel, when Israel started presenting itself as a conservative country, right? You had the administration of Menachem Begin, right? And Menachem Begin was elected, and Milton Friedman started advising Israel's economy. And in 80s, 90s, Israel has become more and more of a right-wing country aligned with right-wing parties. But it used to be the opposite. And it used to be the anti-Israel folks were Republicans who said, this isn't our business, why are we, and it was liberals who supported Israel, because Israel was supposed to be this happy socialist commune in the desert. And, it's complicated, right? And that's a shift. And Horowitz is a great example of that. When Israel was presenting itself as a leftist country, when the Communist Party supported Israel, he supported Israel as a communist, right? Now that Israel is a Republican and conservative cause, there you go. That's David Horowitz, right? It's interesting. It's interesting to look at it. David Horowitz, Israel is really central to what he believes. And in fact, he's written a lot. If you read, he's a right-winger. He did Discover the Networks and all of this. And his kind of belief is that, radical Islam and communism are the same thing. They both oppose America. They both oppose Israel. That's Horowitz, David Horowitz, right? He's different. I wouldn't put him in the same category as like Irving Kristol, right? Irving Kristol is a completely different thing. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyist and CIA guy, and then eventually a neocon. And then Leo Strauss, who's also considered the father of neoconservatism, was never a communist. Leo Strauss was never a communist. Never. Leo Strauss was an authoritarian. Leo Strauss was a right-winger and a conservative. Leo Strauss taught at New School University. Leo Strauss taught at the University in Chicago, I believe. And his thing was he taught philosophy. And he was this philosophy professor who became kind of a mentor to a lot of the people that became big neocons, right? He was like their mentor. And he was this professor. And he was kind of like, if you read Harry Potter, the Slughorn guy, he made a club of like his favorite students who would, go out to dinner with him. And, he had this little club of like his favorite little teacher's pets. And a lot of those people have gone on to be prominent neocons, like, basically he taught Plato's Republic, and he taught his students that they were philosopher kings. That they should rule over the other people, that most Americans are too stupid, but they're smart, they're his students, they understand the world. And he basically, I got Plato behind me. Plato's a great thinker. I love Plato. I love Socrates. But he taught Socrates in a way that was basically like, you're my students and you're philosopher kings. You are better than everyone else. You have the responsibility to rule over the stupid, ignorant rabble and sheep. He was an elitist. That's Leo Strauss. And he was always a conservative. And he actually, from what I understand, Leo Strauss had great admiration for the Nazi political theorist. Leo Strauss was Jewish, but that didn't stop him from admiring the Nazi legal theoretician, Karl, what's his name? Karl, I can't remember his name, the Nazi legal guy. The Nazi legal theorist, Karl something, you know what I mean? He liked him, right? And he quoted him a lot. Leo Strauss was this German academic who fled Nazi Germany because he was Jewish and then became a big philosophy professor Carl Schmitt, who mentored, thank you, Ramiro, who mentored, people at elite schools in the United States. And he kind of formed like a club of students who really looked up to him. And a lot of those people in Leo Strauss's little club, little student teacher's pet club, have gone on to be very prominent people. I don't know, like he was the guy at the World Bank for a while, and I don't know, there's a lot of them, right? A lot of the Bush administration, right? A lot of the like advisors to George W. Bush were people that had been in his little club. That's Leo Strauss. What's also famous about Leo Strauss, interestingly, is that Leo Strauss's favorite TV show was called Gunsmoke, and it was a cowboy TV show. It was a cowboy TV show from the 50s. And I've seen Gunsmoke. I don't know if you ever have. I've seen Gunsmoke. It's a cowboy show. And on Gunsmoke, the good guy always wears a white hat, and he's all good. He does not have any negative attributes, no damage, nothing. He is just Dudley Do-Right. He is darn good. It's like a melodrama. The bad guy wears a black hat, and there is nothing good about the bad guy. He is all bad and all that. And Leo Strauss told his students that their job was to get young people, or to get people in the United States to understand the world like an episode of Gunsmoke. That's what Leo Strauss said. He said, we have to get Americans to think about the world in pure black and white, good and evil terms. And Ronald Reagan's presidency, that's when the Leo Strauss students first started getting in there. What was Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan had been a cowboy actor. And the Reagan administration was being advised by Leo Strauss and his students. And if you look at what Ronald Reagan, a former cowboy actor, did from the White House, he really tried to make foreign policy sound like an episode of Gunsmoke, right? You know, like Ronald Reagan. The communists have kidnapped this plane, and we're going to go in there and take them out. Boy, it's a rough, and George W. Bush, right? He said, we're going to smoke them out. We're going to smoke them out. Smoke them out, Osama bin Laden. And it's like trying to make people think that global politics is a cowboy movie. That's what Leo Strauss was about. That was Leo Strauss. That's neoconservatism. They know it's more complicated. And that's his whole message. He says to his students, you guys are philosopher kings, right? You know that these Contras in Nicaragua are selling cocaine and crack. But to the American people, the Contras wear the white hat and the Sandinistas wear the black hat. Maybe you know that the Sandinistas are feeding people, but to the American people, the Contras wear the black hat. They're all bad, right? That was Leo Strauss. Get Americans to think of politics like it's an action movie, like it's a cowboy movie, right? That's Leo Strauss, right? It was this, and that Leo Strauss and neoconservatism, and I've written all kinds of things about this. Basically, coming out of the Second World War, 50s, after McCarthyism was over, in the late 50s and up into the 60s, it was the left, like liberals, that had the upper hand, because they were into TV and they were into the media and all of that, right? They talk about how TV brought down Joe McCarthy. John F. Kennedy was so good looking, and he was way better on TV. And that in a way, neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, Leo Strauss, was basically just the Republicans figuring out how to get ahead in the TV world, basically, right? That Richard Nixon didn't look good on TV. He was shifty-eyed, right? He didn't understand that you have to look down the barrel of the camera. He was always going, and so he didn't look trustworthy. Richard Nixon, he didn't look good on camera. He didn't look good on TV. And he was very paranoid, and he was this bitter old man who's always looking shifty-eyed. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. That's Richard Nixon, right? He wasn't good on TV, right? Because TV was the liberals' thing, right? That was CIA, Project Mockingbird, they're Democrats, right? Well, neoconservatism was Republicans and conservatives updating their worldview for the television age, right? And a big part of neoconservatism was the evangelical Christian movement, which was an attempt to draw heavily from hippie counterculture and apply it to Christianity. And it's all complicated. And I've written a lot about this. In the upcoming book, there's going to be a lot more on it. But this is what you have to understand. Neoconservatism was basically the Republican Party updating itself for the TV age. And it died when the economy changed, right? Because now we're in a period where the economy isn't good, and that conservatism is based on this, neoconservative propaganda is based on this assumption that America is the greatest country in the world, and everything here is great, and if you don't like that, if you don't agree with that, then you need to move to another country, because this is the greatest country in the world. It's America, so shut your effing mouth, you big hippie. I love America, okay? Move somewhere else. That's neoconservatism. That's not how conservatives talk anymore. Now conservatives are talking about the deep state and the plot against Trump and the drain the swamp. That's not neoconservatism. Leo Strauss would have pulled his hair out. That's not good guy with white hat, black hat. Neoconservatism is done. George W. Bush was the end of neoconservatism. After that, when the economy crashed in 2008, I saw it. Overnight, the Republicans started reading libertarian stuff and questioning the government, and all of a sudden, neocon rhetorical style and all of that is just out of fashion in conservative circles. The conservatives are experimenting with populism and and nationalism, economic nationalism, and even some non-interventionist rhetoric. And this is all based on the fact that the politics in the USA has changed, and that the populism is now a big thing. Populism didn't used to be possible, right? Things are changing. Things are changing, folks. That's I guess my message here. I'm rambling about all kinds of stuff. So, folks, it's always fun. We've been on here for quite a while. This has been going for quite some time. If there's anything else you folks want me to talk about it, you better say it now, because I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to wrap this up pretty soon. So give me a super chat or give me a shout out if you want me to say something, because the time is now. I'm going to be wrapping this up pretty soon. So last chance. What else do people want me to talk about? Last chance. Ramiro says, thoughts on paleoconservatism. Well, paleoconservatism, that was big. It's the opposite of neoconservatism, right? It's Pat Buchanan, it's economic protectionism, it's more libertarian economic kind of stuff, and it's complicated. It's basically, because neocons were staunch defenders of the status quo. Paleoconservatism became people that were right-wing but anti-status quo. And in the 90s, you had, like the militia movement, Posse Comitatus, you had the rancher protests, you had, there was all this stuff going on where there were these people that were right-wing. They were not left-wing at all. You had Waco, the incident at Waco, for example. These people are like fanatically religious, they have guns, they're out in the countryside, they're conservative, they're small farmers, they're small business owners, they're ranchers, they're against the status quo, but they're not left-wing at all. There's nothing socialist or communist about them. They hate the left more than anything. So what are they? They're paleoconservatives. And Pat Buchanan kind of became the electoral expression of them. And actually, a lot of what the paleoconservatives advocated in the 90s has become part of the Trump platform. I remember 1996, when Pat Buchanan ran for president, what was one of his central platforms? Build a wall. I mean, look it up. Pat Buchanan, this third-party candidate, the paleoconservative candidate, Pat Buchanan, that was one of his platforms. He was going to build a wall against Mexico, right? Well, now that's part of the Republican Party. A lot of paleoconservatism, now that neoconservatism has kind of collapsed, paleoconservatism has started to slip back into the Republican Party. And I think that's interesting. And that paleoconservatism, more than anything, represents kind of lower levels of American capital. Neoconservatism is just a different, it's a right-wing face for some of the richest people in the world. I mean, all the big think tanks, Council on Foreign Relations is full of neocons. The American Enterprise Institute is full of neocons. But paleoconservatism, that's more the Cato Institute, right? That's lower levels of American capital. That's the old John Birch Society, right? That's for the fracking companies, right? And that paleoconservatism represents lower levels of capital that don't feel like they're part of the club. Neoconservatism was always part of the club. Right, neoconservatism, that's Rockefeller, Carnegie, and DuPont. And sometimes Rockefeller and Carnegie and DuPont fund liberals, and sometimes they fund conservatives, but they're for the status quo. Paleoconservatism is a kind of anti-status quo conservatism that represents lower levels of capital. And it has a lot of strength in Republican circles. Now that the neoconservatism is out of fashion, paleoconservatism is much more popular in conservative circles. I'm being asked about Anthony Sutton and the idea that Wall Street and all that. Well, see, Anthony Sutton is quite interesting. Anthony Sutton, I've read his stuff. He claims that both the Bolsheviks and Hitler were all products of the British, intelligence and all that. And I don't agree with what he said. His book claiming the Bolshevik Revolution was funded by and even his book on Britain, right? That Hitler went to war with the British, folks. I mean, the British helped him come to power because they would rather have had him than the communists. But there was, in Anthony Sutton's book on the British, he kind of misses the point that when the Nazis were in power, they didn't pay back their loans to British bankers. They did a lot to economically antagonize Britain, so much so that Britain eventually went to war with them. And he kind of makes it sound like, Anthony Sutton, it's this kind of view, and he's paleoconservative, it's this kind of view that like communism is just a front for the international CIA bankers, and that the Nazism is just a front, and it's all just a big conspiracy. And he's kind of missing the point, and his book on the Russian Revolution, his book on Hitler, they point to true things, but they kind of miss the point, right? That there were things about the Nazis that were fundamentally contrary to what the British wanted. The British thought the Nazis were a threat to them, ultimately, right? Now, they thought they were better than the communists, and that's why they backed them and supported them, at the beginning. But at the same time, and then with the Bolsheviks, right? I mean, there were a lot of American capitalists who did business with the Soviet Union. Does that make the Soviet Union their puppet? No, it's more complicated than that. Nikki Gallo says Jason Unruhe spreads anti-Chinese propaganda. Well, I don't agree with everything that Jason says, right? And there's no secret about that. I haven't paid much attention to what he's been saying lately about coronavirus. I'm sure though he doesn't have a positive view of the People's Republic of China. I tend to think very positive things about it. So we're going to disagree, but I refrain from using language like you just used. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, heated like that. I think we just disagree, Whatever happened to I disagree? Seriously, whatever happened to I disagree? In left-wing circles, no one can ever just disagree with anybody. Everyone's got to be a Nazi. Everyone's got to be a fascist. Everyone's got to be a phony, I think Jason is a great guy who has good intentions. I don't agree with him about China and about a lot of other things. But I disagree, right? This Clara person, right, who wanted to debate me. Okay, well, we disagree. And I'm not going to debate her because I looked at her Twitter page and the way things got, I thought, okay, this is going to get ugly. I don't want to get ugly, but I disagree. You can be a leftist and disagree with me. And that's fine, right? We need to have more civil discourse. We're never going to resolve these issues if we just have heated hate, leftist on leftist, right? I mean, it's not going to go there. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of what Jason's saying right now about China I disagree with, but, I think he just disagrees. This Clara person, right? She disagrees with me, and I was going to debate her, but then, she started cursing me out, and then I saw some other stuff on her wall, and I thought, I really don't want to be a part of this. So, you can disagree. We need to learn to disagree in a civil manner, right? At this conference, be sure to register for the CPI conference, folks. If you haven't registered, please be there. It's going to be really important. The Center for Political Innovation, we're going to do some amazing stuff, promoting socialism and education. If this is true, why are Republican governments so supportive of big oil? Well, here's the thing. Republican governments were supportive of big oil in the past. But if you'll notice, there's a pretty big divide now, right? Barack Obama oversaw the drop of oil prices in 2014, right? And the result, at that point, the fracking companies almost were out of power. And if you look at all the money that's going to PragerU and the Tea Party, and the Koch brothers, that's fracking money. The oil price drop was good for the big oil companies. Obama presided over that, and it was good for them. Why? Because it put their competitors out of business. It caused all kinds of problems in Russia and Iran and Venezuela. It was basically a Walmart scheme, right? And Obama and big oil were for those low oil prices in 2014 because it was a Walmart scheme, right? When Walmart comes to a town, they lower their prices, they put their competitors out of business, then they shoot their prices back up, right? And that's what Obama was doing. The frackers were almost destroyed by it, right? And if you'll remember, Sarah Palin, who ran against Obama, what was her campaign slogan? Drill, baby, drill. Well, what was she talking about? She was saying, open up Alaska to the little oil companies. The big oil companies don't want to drill in Alaska because they want to keep it in their back pocket, right? They want to keep it there. The little oil companies don't have enough already. They want to make a profit, right? The big oil companies don't necessarily even want to frack in the United States because they have enough, they don't need to, and they want to, keep the fracking oil in case something happens, right? Whereas the little oil companies, they want to frack because they want to make a lot of money, right? Fracking, that's little oil. That's little oil's operation. Now, since the oil price dropped, BP has moved into fracking a little bit. It's complicated, right? But, Republicans tend to be the party of big oil and as much as Democrats are, right? For most of the Cold War, the Democrats and the Republicans had the same constituency. This divide between big oil and little oil is very new. It really got going in the age of fracking, right? I mean, as fracking really got going in the Bush years, and then especially under Obama, that's where the divide happened. When Obama dropped the oil prices, which had the effect of putting a lot of frackers out of business, it's a very new divide, right? And that I actually talk about in my book, Oil and the Capitalist Crisis, how big oil started moving out of the Republican Party toward the end of the Bush years, right? And it's kind of amazing. The foundation money and stuff that was going to Republicans all started shifting to the Democrats, right? Big oil, right? Big oil funds the Council on Foreign Relations. It used to be Council on Foreign Relations was just as much for the Democrats as it is for the Republicans. Now, if you read what the Council on Foreign Relations puts out, yes, they print Republican stuff every so often, but they don't like Trump. Read Foreign Affairs. They do not like Trump. CFR don't like Trump. They're conservatives, right? But they don't care much for Trump. Trump is for lower levels of capital. This is a newer divide. You have to remember, up until 2008, 2009, there was no capitalist crisis, right? The 90s, the U.S. economy was booming. There was a downturn in the early 90s, but it pretty well got swept away, right? 80s, 70s, and 80s, the U.S. economy was far better. And when the economy is good, we're all friends after 6. That's what Ronald Reagan said. We're all friends after 6. And it was true. The Democrats and the Republicans, they got money from the same people. They went to the same bar and drank afterwards, and they agreed on almost everything. They just talked different. They're all friends after 6. It's only in a time of capitalist crisis. It's only when the economy is in a state of crisis, right? It's when there is what you call a drop in the rate of profits. When the economy, when there's a falling rate of profit, that's when, and Nikki Gallo says, read Oil and the Capitalist Crisis by Caleb Maupin, and you should read it, right? Read it, or listen to the speech I gave in Brazil that it's based on. It's online. That it's only when there's a crisis that the capitalists begin to fight among each other. When the economy is good, overall, the capitalists kind of have a consensus among themselves, right? Until from about, there was some big disagreements in the ruling class in the 70s, in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there was clear disagreements, but it wasn't economically based. It was based on a global crisis. That communism was winning all over the world, and there were different strategies about how to oppose it, and there was the black question in the United States, and there was restructuring the global economy and the military, and there was a fight within the ruling class. But it was pretty much resolved by about 1978. About the Carter years, Brzezinski's, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor to Jimmy Carter, got the Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan, right? And he went on, Brzezinski went from the Nixon administration to the Carter administration to the Reagan administration to the Clinton administration, and now his daughter's on Morning Joe, right? That they were all the same. It was all the same crowd. They were all friends after 6 until the crisis, right? And Trump realizes that big oil doesn't like him, but he's trying to get their support. You remember Rex Tillerson of ExxonMobil was in his administration, and he tried. But what happened? It didn't work out too well. Trump would prefer that big oil back him, but they don't, right? They don't like him. So it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. But yes, this is a new divide. And the fracking stuff, when you have separate companies running fracking, the fracking cowboys, they call them in the Wall Street Journal, that's where the difference has arisen. I hope that answers your question. It's a good question. I'm glad you called that out there. Sometimes I think it's better when people ask questions and engage about this stuff, because these things are complicated. It's not that simple. But yes, the fracking capitalists tend to be Republican at this point. Big oil companies now have moved closer to the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean they don't support other folks, right? Big oil money goes to fund the American Enterprise Institute, and they tend to be Republicans, right? Now, they don't like Trump, though. They're that kind of Mitt Romney, neocon Republican, where Trump, there's some things about Trump they don't like, but they tend to favor Republican economic policies. CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, though, you remember in 2014, they published a whole issue of their magazine called The Social Democratic Future of America, basically predicting the rise of Bernie Sanders. There's a divide in the ruling class. How do we manage the American people? We don't have room for them in our factories anymore. We don't need them anymore. There's too many of them. How do we manage the American people? What do we do? Well, one section says, screw them. Put them in jail. Send them off to fight a war. Let them die on opioids. That's their problem. A bunch of losers, they ought to get a job. That's the Republican belief, right? Another faction says, let's manage them. Give them some health care. Give them $1,000 a month. Just, give them a lot of social media flashing lights to look at. Give them a lot of pornography and just let them kind of gradually go away, stop reproducing, kill themselves. There's the divide, right? One section says, austerity now, crush them. The other side says controlled demolition, right? Do we boil the frogs gradually? or do we stomp on them? That's kind of the divide among the ruling class. And the wealthier section that can afford things like universal basic income, and they want to do things gradually because they can afford it and it works better. Whereas the lower levels of the bourgeoisie just need money now. They want money now, so they just crush them. We don't care. Lock them in jail. Give us a contract to lock them in jail. Give us a military contract. Start a war. I mean, they want to make the lower levels of American capital are desperate for profits, right? One of those oil fracking guys probably killed himself. I mean, I guess he drove into a wall, a car accident, but it looked like a suicide, right? Those guys, they go under. They go under, right? They might be millionaires and billionaires. They go out of business. They're screwed. Whereas Rockefeller's never going to go out of business. Carnegie's never going to go out of business. DuPont's never going to go out of business. So it's a divide, right? And it's what do? Do we manage the workers? Do we try to manage and control people and gradually assert control? Or do we crush them? I think that's a divide. And it's a big divide, right? The richest of the rich tend to, view things. Then they tend to not think of their own stuff, too. That's the big thing. The richest of the rich have big think tanks and big, they have all these academics who do it, right? Whereas the lower levels of the rich just believe in free market capitalism because it made them rich and anyone can do it. And they don't want to hear what academics have to say, or if they do, they want them to be PragerU people who will tell them what they want to hear. It's kind of fascinating, the divides in the ruling class. You pay attention to them. Very fascinating stuff. I'm definitely not voting for Bloomberg, but there you go. But listen, folks, it's getting late. And so I just want to let you know that a new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Be sure to sign up for the CPI conference right now. Remember, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Sign up for the CPI conference. It's going to be amazing. You don't want to miss it. You will regret it if you miss it. So sign up and register right now. All my best, folks. All my best. TTYL.